At a flea market in northern Michigan, a homeless veteran Navy SEAL found a skinny German Shepherd puppy priced at just $5. When a violent machine noise triggered the veteran's darkest memory, the tiny puppy walked over and placed one paw on his boot. Nolan bought him, named him Alder, and expected nothing more than companionship. Then a hidden microchip connected Alder to a missing search and rescue dog. That forgotten record would lead them toward a closed forest, a dangerous storm, and a truth someone had tried to hide. But before it was over, the $5 puppy would help save more than one life. Tell us where you're watching from. Then like this video and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. Morning came gently to the northern forests of Michigan. Along the high ground above Lake Larkspur, the first weeks of autumn had begun to touch the birches with yellow. White pines rose dark and straight behind them, their crowns catching the early sunlight, while thin bands of mist drifted over the lake below. From Silver Crown Fire Lookout, the water looked almost unnaturally blue, a sheet of polished glass laid between miles of forest. It was the kind of morning that made a man believe nothing terrible had ever happened in the world. Nolan Pierce Varden knew better. At 43, the former Navy SEAL still carried the physical shape of the life he had left behind. He stood 6'1", broad through the shoulders, his body hard and balanced rather than bulky, built by years in which endurance had mattered more than appearance. His face was angular and weathered, with a defined jaw, moderate cheekbones, a straight nose, and a thin healed scar running close to the edge of his left eyebrow. Deep blue-gray eyes sat beneath a slightly broad brow, watchful even when he appeared relaxed. His skin was sun-browned and roughened by weather. His dark brown hair was cut short in the practical military style he had never bothered to change, with premature silver beginning at both temples. Dark stubble, touched here and there with gray, followed the line of his jaw. He wore what he nearly always wore now, an old olive field jacket over a red and dark navy plaid flannel shirt, dark green cargo pants, worn brown leather boots, and a scratched military watch on his left wrist. There had been a time when Nolan's clothes had carried patches, names, unit designations, and meanings. Now they carried pine dust. That suited him better. He crouched beside a pump housing near the lower Silver Crown trailhead, one knee pressed into damp earth while he tightened a corroded coupling with a wrench. The pump fed emergency water lines used during dry months. It was not complicated work. Pipes either held or they leaked. Bolts were either tight or they were not. Machines rarely asked a man why he was still alive. That was one reason Nolan preferred them. He gave the fitting another quarter turn. From somewhere beyond the western tree line, a chainsaw started. The sound entered the morning like a blade. Nolan's hand stopped. The wrench slipped from his fingers and struck the metal housing. For half a second there was only Michigan. Then there wasn't. White. Not snow, ice. A helicopter lying crooked across a frozen lake in Alaska, its damaged fuselage tilted toward a fracture in the surface. Rotor blades bent at angles that no machine had been designed to survive. A line stretched taut through Nolan's gloved hands. Someone shouting. Mason. Mason Creed had been 42 when he died. A compactly powerful man with a square face, short light brown hair, bright brown eyes, and the irritating ability to make a joke at precisely the moment everyone else had decided humor was inappropriate. In Nolan's memory, Mason still wore the navy and charcoal winter rescue gear from that day. Insulated shell rimed with ice, black gloves gripping a line. Nolan, the sound of ice cracking, then black water. Nolan's lungs forgot where they were. His eyes snapped toward the tree line, escape route road, pump house door, higher ground. His right hand closed around nothing. The chainsaw continued several hundred yards away, perfectly ordinary, probably cutting a storm-damaged pine. His body did not care. His heart accelerated. His breathing shortened until each breath felt too small to belong to him. Then a crow landed on the pump house roof. It stared down at Nolan and cawed once, harshly, almost accusingly. Nolan blinked. The bird cawed again, louder this time, as if deeply unimpressed by the emotional complexity below. Nolan stared at it. Helpful, he muttered. The crow tilted its head. Michigan returned by degrees. Pines, wet soil, the smell of cold metal and cedar. No helicopter, no fractured ice, no Mason. Nolan bent slowly, retrieved the wrench, and forced one long breath through his nose, then another. By the time an old green pickup came rattling down the service road, Nolan was tightening the coupling again as though nothing had happened. That, too, was a skill. Wyatt Bell parked beside the trailhead and climbed out with the deliberation of a man who had spent 72 years refusing to hurry simply because other people wanted him to. A retired forest ranger, Wyatt stood about 5'10", still broad across the shoulders, with a solid body that had softened around the belly. but not yet surrendered to age. His square face was deeply lined from decades outdoors, his nose large and slightly hooked, his skin permanently browned by sun and wind. Sparse silver-white hair remained around the sides of his head beneath a faded forest green baseball cap, and a short, thick silver mustache sat above a mouth usually arranged in mild disapproval. He wore a brown canvas chore jacket over a pale denim work shirt, dark khaki work pants, and old brown leather boots. Wyatt believed affection should always arrive disguised as an inconvenience. 2 winters earlier, he had found Nolan sleeping in an aging pickup behind a hardware store, and had informed him that an unused maintenance cabin below Silver Crown needed a stubborn fool willing to keep raccoons from unionizing. Nolan had accepted only after Wyatt agreed he could work for the place, so Nolan repaired footbridges, cleared fallen timber, maintained pumps, replaced fence posts, checked drainage channels, and walked old service roads after storms. Neither man called it charity. That was how they remained friends. Wyatt leaned against the pickup. "Pump dead?" "No, shame. I was hoping to complain about the county." "You can still complain." Wyatt considered that. "You're right." His pale blue eyes moved briefly to the wrench near Nolan's boot. Wyatt noticed details. 38 years in the woods had trained him to see what did not belong. He also knew when not to ask. "Cabin heater filter's finished," he said. "It worked yesterday. So did I. Doesn't mean either of us should be trusted today." Nolan stood. Wyatt pointed toward town. "You're going to Copperville anyway." "I wasn't. You are now." Nolan wiped his hands on a rag. "The cabin won't repair itself. It's been trying for 30 years. Wyatt looked toward the crooked roofline visible between the trees. "And look how well that's going." 10 minutes later, Nolan was driving toward Copperville. The road wound through a bright patchwork of pine, maple, and birch. Lake light flashed between tree trunks. Fallen leaves skittered across the pavement in small yellow armies. Copperville itself was hardly a town by most standards. A few blocks of brick storefronts, a diner, hardware store, veterinary clinic, gas station, church steeple, and enough pickup trucks to suggest the automobile industry had once signed an agreement with the local population. The weekend flea market sat just beyond town on a gravel lot beside an old feed warehouse. Nolan stopped because flea markets did not require conversation. Stores expected a man to know what he wanted. Flea markets respected confusion. Rows of folding tables stretched beneath patched canopies. Fishing reels lay beside thermoses. Old license plates leaned against boxes of hand tools. Hunting coats hung from metal racks. Someone sold apple pies from beneath a handwritten sign. A man argued with another man over whether an ancient radio was vintage or simply broken. Nolan moved among them slowly, looking for a heater filter and perhaps a replacement socket wrench he did not technically need. Then he saw the puppy. At first, Nolan noticed the sign. "German Shepherd puppy, $5. Then he looked above it. A man stood behind the table, holding a small black and tan German Shepherd in both arms. Chet Barlow was somewhere in his mid-50s, wiry rather than strong, with a narrow, weathered face, thinning sandy gray hair under a brown cap, and a short, uneven beard that suggested shaving had become a task he performed only when absolutely necessary. A faded checked work shirt hung loosely from his shoulders. He had the practical, slightly tired manner of a man who had spent most of his life making decisions based on what fit in the truck. There was nothing cruel in the way he held the puppy, only impatience. The little German Shepherd could not have been more than 3 or 4 months old. He was small enough to fit easily in Chet's arms, with a narrow body that showed the faint outline of ribs beneath slightly fluffy puppy fur. He was thin, but not sickly. His black saddle was already beginning to form across his back, contrasting with warm tan legs and chest. His muzzle was dark, almost completely black. His paws looked absurdly large compared with the rest of him, as though nature had delivered the feet for the adult dog before finishing the puppy. One ear had nearly decided to stand. The other still folded softly to the side. A tiny natural notch marked the edge of his right ear. But it was the eyes Nolan noticed. Deep amber brown, quiet, not frightened, not pleading, watching. The puppy studied people as they passed. Not their faces alone, hands, movement, direction. Then his gaze settled on Nolan. Nolan stopped. Chet noticed. $5, he said. Nolan looked at the sign again. $5? Last one. Chet shifted the puppy against his forearm. No papers. Skinny little guy. Eats more than you'd expect. Friend of mine ended up with him, then I ended up with him. That's about the entire family tree as far as I know. The puppy kept staring at Nolan. Chet scratched his beard. Had somebody say they'd come back yesterday. They didn't. Nope. Chet glanced down at the dog. Nobody came back for him. Something tightened behind Nolan's ribs. Not pain exactly. Recognition. He disliked it. Nolan put his hands into his jacket pockets. I don't need a dog. Chet shrugged, wasn't asking. That answer made Nolan like him slightly more. He turned away. He made it almost 15 feet. Behind him came no bark, no whining, no scramble of claws. Yet Nolan stopped. He did not know why at first. Then he looked back. The puppy had twisted in Chet's arms to keep Nolan in sight. Dozens of people moved between them. Children passed with paper cups of cider. A woman carried an old lamp. Someone laughed near the pie stand. The puppy ignored all of them. His amber eyes remained fixed on Nolan. Then Nolan took another step away. The puppy leaned forward, not toward freedom, toward him. For one irrational instant, Nolan felt the old and unwelcome sensation that he had experienced in difficult places around the world. The feeling that something had shifted before he understood what it meant. He almost returned. Instead, he told himself a dog was a responsibility. Food, vet bills, time, attachment, loss, especially loss. Nolan turned forward again. That should have been the end of it. Then the wood splitter started. The machine stood near the far edge of the market where someone was demonstrating farm equipment. The engine roared. A hydraulic arm descended. Metal slammed against timber. The sound split the morning. Nolan's body locked. Not slowly, completely. His shoulders tightened. His hands curled inside the pockets of his field jacket. The gravel beneath his boots became ice. He saw the helicopter again. He heard Mason. The rescue line strained across Nolan's palms. A crack traveled under his feet. Then the impossible black opening beneath white ice. His heart hammered. The market narrowed around him. People became shapes. He measured distance without choosing to. Truck, fence, warehouse wall, open lane. His breath came shallow. Then something moved behind him. Chet swore softly. The puppy wriggled free. He dropped the last foot awkwardly, landed with his oversized front paws spread too wide, nearly sat down by accident, recovered, and trotted toward Nolan. Not gracefully, not bravely, like a puppy with more intention than coordination. He stopped against Nolan's right boot. The little dog's head turned toward the wood splitter. His almost upright ears shifted forward. He stared at the noise, then looked up at Nolan. Noise, Nolan, noise, Nolan. No bark, no growl, no heroic stance. The puppy simply remained there. Then one oversized paw lifted. It settled on the toe of Nolan's worn brown boot. Barely any weight, maybe 5 pounds of pressure. But Nolan felt it. He looked down. Amber eyes met blue-gray. The wood splitter struck again. Nolan focused on the paw. Tan fur, black nails, a little dirt between the pads. Not ice, not Alaska, a puppy. Michigan, October light. He inhaled, the breath shook. He let it out again. The market widened. Sound returned in layers. A vendor calling out a price, a child complaining about cold cider, someone laughing, wind moving through poplars. Nolan looked toward Chet. Chet had gone quiet. You teach him that? Chet frowned. Teach him what? Nolan looked down. The puppy removed his paw and sat, slightly crooked, beside Nolan's boot. Nothing. Chet came over. I told you he's a weird little thing. The puppy looked at Chet, then immediately back at Nolan. Nolan pulled his wallet out. He found a $5 bill, held it for a moment. This was ridiculous. A cabin with a leaking roof. Unpredictable work. A man who still woke fighting ghosts. Exactly the sort of life no responsible person would choose for a puppy. Nolan handed Chet the bill. Chet took it. For $5, don't expect much. Nolan looked down at the small German shepherd. I've paid more for worse decisions. The corner of Chet's mouth moved. Fair enough. He handed Nolan a thin piece of cord that had been serving as a temporary lead. Good luck. Nolan stared at the cord. To me or him? Chet considered the question. Him. That almost earned a smile. Almost. Nolan walked toward the parking lot. After 4 steps, he heard the soft, uneven rhythm of puppy feet behind him. He stopped. The German shepherd stopped too. Nolan looked back. The puppy looked up. Come on. The puppy followed. At the old white pickup, Nolan opened the passenger door. The seat might as well have been a cliff. The puppy placed both front paws against the floorboard, pushed, and slid backward. He tried again. Same result. Nolan waited. The puppy stared at the truck as though personally betrayed by its height. 3rd time's the charm. The puppy gathered himself. Nolan watched him prepare, then sighed. Before the attempt could begin, Nolan bent, slid one hand beneath the puppy's chest and the other under his hindquarters and lifted him. He weighed surprisingly little. Warm. All ribs, paws, fur, and heartbeat. For a moment, Nolan stood there holding him. The puppy rested against Nolan's field jacket without struggling. Nolan had carried injured men, children during evacuations, equipment, bodies. He could not remember the last time he had held something simply because it needed help getting onto a seat. He placed the puppy on the passenger side. Don't make this symbolic. The puppy sat down. One soft ear leaned sideways. Nolan closed the door. On the drive back toward Silver Crown, the puppy watched the forest pass. Then Nolan, then the road, then Nolan again. Every few minutes he seemed to verify that the man remained exactly where he had been. Nolan tried not to notice. He failed. By the time they reached the cabin, afternoon sunlight had turned warm and golden over Lake Larkspur. The cabin stood below the old lookout road beneath white pines and birches, a small weathered structure with dark timber siding, a patched roof, a narrow porch, and one chimney that leaned just enough to make Wyatt complain about it twice a month. Nolan opened the passenger door. The puppy looked down. This time Nolan did not wait for the first failed attempt. He lifted him out. Inside, the puppy immediately became serious. He sniffed the threshold, walked 3 careful steps, paused at the kitchen, looked toward the narrow hallway, turned toward the stove. Nolan watched. "You doing an inspection?" The puppy stepped sideways and bumped directly into the leg of the kitchen table. He froze. Nolan's mouth twitched. The puppy sniffed the offending table leg with great suspicion. "Good work." Next came a burlap sack of potatoes beside the cabinet. The puppy managed to get his head halfway inside before Nolan pulled him backward. "No." The puppy sneezed. Nolan filled a shallow metal bowl with water and set it down. The German Shepherd drank as though personally responsible for lowering the lake level. Then he coughed, jerked backward, and stared at the bowl. Nolan folded his arms. Definitely the bowl's fault. The puppy looked at him. Something unfamiliar moved through Nolan's chest. Small, almost warm. He refused to name it. Outside the kitchen window, sunlight reached the stand of alder trees growing near the lake's damp edge. Their leaves trembled in the wind, green beginning to yellow. Nolan looked from the trees to the puppy. "Alder." The German Shepherd tilted his head. One ear rose. The other fell farther sideways. "Alder," Nolan repeated. The puppy blinked, close enough. And somehow, without ceremony, the nameless $5 dog became Alder. That evening, Nolan found an old wool blanket and folded it beside the wood stove. He put down a small portion of food, more cautiously than Alder thought necessary. The puppy ate, explored the cabin twice, stole one of Nolan's socks, lost interest in the sock, attempted to chew a bootlace, and finally collapsed onto the blanket with the abrupt surrender unique to very young animals. 1 minute awake, the next completely gone. Nolan sat in the battered chair beside the stove. Alder's belly moved gently, in, out, in, out. Nolan watched longer than he meant to. The cabin sounded different. The stove clicked. Wind brushed the patched window. A small dog breathed near the fire. For 2 years, Nolan had considered silence the safest form of company. Tonight, silence had a heartbeat. He went to bed sometime after midnight. Mason found him before dawn. In the dream, Alaska had no sky, only white ice beneath Nolan's knees. The helicopter listed toward black water. A rescue rope burned across his gloves. Mason stood farther away than he should have been. "Nolan!" Nolan pulled. The line tightened. The ice cracked. "Mason!" Water opened. A black mouth in a white world. Mason disappeared to the waist. Nolan lunged. The surface broke again. Everything became water. Cold so complete it felt hot. A hand slipping away, then nothing. Nolan woke sitting halfway upright. His right hand was clenched around Mason's old dog tag, the metal edge pressed into his palm. His lungs dragged at the air. Cabin, dark, bed. But his body remained under ice. He closed his eyes. Bad idea. The water came back. Then something touched his wrist. Nolan froze. Warm breath. Soft fur. He looked down. Alder stood beside the bed. The puppy must have crossed the room after waking. He was not doing anything trained. There was no practice pressure. No command response. No miracle. Alder simply rested his small black muzzle across Nolan's wrist and stayed. Nolan stared at him. The puppy's eyes were barely open with sleep. He looked exhausted, as if even this small act had interrupted something important. Nolan's grip on the dog tag loosened. He listened. Alder breathed in, out. Nolan tried the same. The first breath caught. The second went deeper. The third belonged to Michigan again. The dark walls returned. The stove, the window, the chair. No ice, no helicopter. No Mason calling from beneath black water. Alder remained beside the bed until Nolan's hand stopped shaking. Then the puppy yawned. A spectacular, jaw-stretching yawn entirely inappropriate to the solemnity of the moment. Nolan let out something that might have been half a laugh. "You have terrible timing." Alder rested his chin more heavily on Nolan's wrist. Nolan looked toward the old blanket by the stove, then back at the puppy. "You crossed the whole room for this?" Alder's eyes closed. Nolan did not know why the puppy had come. Maybe he had heard movement. Maybe Nolan had made a sound in his sleep. Maybe Alder was simply lonely. It did not matter. Nolan lowered his hand and touched 2 fingers lightly to the fur behind Alder's ear. The puppy leaned into the contact. Outside, Silver Crown slept beneath a clear northern sky. Lake Larkspur held the stars. The forest stood quiet around the small cabin. Earlier that day, Nolan had paid $5 for a German shepherd puppy no one had returned to claim. He had assumed he was bringing home a responsibility, a mouth to feed, another problem requiring maintenance. He did not yet understand the habit Alder would slowly reveal. Whenever the little dog wandered ahead, down a trail, across a room, into whatever life waited beyond that cabin, he would stop, turn, and look back, as though making certain that the quiet man behind him had not disappeared. That first night, beside a bed haunted by old water, Alder had already done it once. By the third morning, Nolan discovered that owning a puppy required a category of courage the Navy had neglected to cover. He stood in the pet food aisle of Bellwether Hardware and Supply, with both hands resting on the handle of a shopping cart, studying 3 different bags of puppy food as if one of them contained instructions for dismantling an explosive. Large breed puppy, high protein puppy, sensitive stomach puppy. The labels were bright, cheerful, and deeply unhelpful. Alder was 15 weeks old, underweight, and apparently capable of consuming anything that did not move quickly enough to escape him. Nolan had already caught him attempting to eat a corner of the old hearth rug that morning. None of the bags said for a German shepherd purchased for $5 by a man who has no idea what he is doing. Nolan picked up the first bag, put it back, read the second, put that back too. An elderly woman farther down the aisle watched him for several seconds before quietly taking her cat litter and leaving, perhaps deciding she did not want to be present when the tactical decision finally occurred. 10 minutes later, Nolan rolled the cart toward the register with all 3 bags. He told himself he was comparing them. The fact that he paid for all 3 complicated that defense. When he returned to Silver Crown, Wyatt Bell was sitting on the cabin porch with a mug of coffee balanced on one knee. Alder sat between Wyatt's boots. That alone was suspicious. Wyatt had spent the previous 2 days claiming that puppies were simply wolves with poor bladder control. Now the little German shepherd was chewing something while the old ranger stared toward Lake Larkspur with the exaggerated innocence of a man standing beside evidence. Nolan carried the first food bag from the truck. Alder lifted his head. Something pale protruded from the corner of his mouth. Nolan narrowed his eyes. What is he eating? Wyatt looked down. No idea. Alder chewed. Nolan stepped closer. Is that chicken? Wyatt sipped his coffee. Could be. You gave him chicken. That's a serious accusation. Nolan pulled the small piece from Alder's mouth. It was unquestionably chicken. Wyatt looked at the 3 bags in the truck bed and raised one silver eyebrow. The Navy didn't cover puppy nutrition. Apparently national security has limits. Wyatt's mustache twitched. 3 bags? Research. Looks expensive. Nolan glanced down at Alder. The puppy had already forgotten the chicken and was attacking one of Nolan's bootlaces. Apparently so. Life inside the cabin changed without asking permission. At first, the changes were small enough that Nolan could pretend they were temporary. A second water bowl appeared beside the stove because Alder had developed the strange ability to step into the first one at least once a day. A faded towel stayed near the door for muddy paws. One of Nolan's old wool blankets migrated permanently from a storage box to the patch of floor nearest the stove, and nearly every object below knee level became, in Alder's opinion, an invitation to conduct research with his teeth. The puppy stole one of Nolan's socks and carried it proudly through the cabin before dropping it beneath the kitchen table. He discovered an old work glove beside the woodbox, dragged it halfway across the room, became tired, and fell asleep with his head still resting on it. Outside, he found a dead birch branch nearly 4 feet long and spent an unreasonable amount of time attempting to carry it sideways between 2 trees spaced only 3 feet apart. Nolan watched from the porch. Alder walked forward. The branch struck the first trunk. He backed up, tried another angle, hit the second trunk. He stopped, considered the problem, tried again. Nolan took a drink of coffee. This is painful to watch. Alder dropped the branch and stared at him, then picked it up again. Determination isn't always intelligence. The branch hit the tree. Nolan almost smiled. There were other discoveries. Squirrels, for example. Alder encountered his first one on a bright afternoon when sunlight turned the fallen birch leaves nearly gold. The squirrel ran across the path. Alder froze. His ears lifted as far as their uneven architecture allowed. Then the puppy launched himself after it with the unqualified confidence of a creature who had never studied trees. The squirrel went up a white pine. Alder did not. He arrived at the trunk, looked upward, then paced around the base as if waiting for an explanation. Nolan stopped several yards behind him. You're going to be disappointed a lot. Alder looked back, then at the tree, then back at Nolan. Eventually, he trotted toward him, dignity slightly damaged but otherwise intact. Their walks remained short. Nolan knew enough about developing joints to avoid pushing a young German shepherd too hard, even before anyone had formally told him so. They followed the easy trails around Lake Larkspur, where the ground was soft with needles and the hills mild enough for Alder's oversized paws. The puppy liked being ahead. Not far, usually 5 or 6 yards. He would trot with his nose close to the earth, fascinated by deer tracks, damp leaves, old pine cones, and invisible messages left by every animal that had crossed before him. Then, after a few moments, he would pause. His head would rise. He would glance toward Nolan. Only after finding him would Alder continue. Nolan initially assumed it was uncertainty, a puppy in a new place making sure the person with the food had not disappeared. But he began noticing the consistency of it. Different trail, same behavior, different time of day, same check. Nolan said nothing about it. He had learned long ago that noticing something and naming it were 2 different acts. One evening he sat at the scarred kitchen table repairing an old portable radio Wyatt used when checking remote trail sections. The back panel was open. Tiny screws sat in a coffee saucer. Alder had spent several minutes trying to convince Nolan that the screwdriver was a chew toy, failed, and finally curled against one of Nolan's boots. A burst of static cracked through the radio when Nolan adjusted a contact. His fingers stopped. Not a full reaction, just enough. A small tightening in the hand, a change in his breathing. Alder's eyes opened. The puppy lifted his head from the boot. Nolan looked down. "I'm fine." Alder stared at him for another second, decided whatever had happened was apparently not worth waking fully for, and lowered his head again. 5 minutes later he was asleep. Nolan left his foot exactly where it was. He could have moved. He didn't. That bothered him less than it should have. 4 days after Alder came home, Wyatt arrived shortly after breakfast with someone Nolan had never seen before. The woman stepping from the mud-splashed dark blue Subaru was around 38 and stood perhaps 5 feet 6, with a lean, healthy build that suggested she spent more of her working life restraining nervous animals than sitting behind a desk. Her oval face had soft but clearly defined features, a neat chin, and hazel green eyes that seemed to notice details without turning observation into judgment. A scattering of freckles crossed her lightly sun-browned nose. Her chestnut brown hair carried faint copper tones in the morning light and reached about shoulder length, though she had tied it low at the back of her neck. She wore dark jeans tucked into brown waterproof boots, a moss green and cream flannel shirt beneath a charcoal gray veterinary utility vest, and a plain leather-strapped watch. A dark brown medical bag hung from one hand. Nolan looked at Wyatt. "No." Wyatt climbed the porch steps. "You don't even know why she's here. She has a veterinary bag." The woman glanced at the bag. "That gave me away." Wyatt pointed toward her. "Dr. Camille Rowan." Camille offered Nolan her free hand. "Nolan, you already know my name. Wyatt talks." Wyatt looked offended. "I report relevant facts." Camille glanced toward the old ranger. "He spent 8 minutes telling me your chimney is leaning." "It is." "Then 6 minutes telling me it's not urgent." "It isn't." Nolan folded his arms. "I was going to take Alder into town." Wyatt gave him a flat look. "When?" Nolan did not answer. "Exactly." Camille's mouth curved faintly, but she did not join Wyatt in the attack. Nolan appreciated that. She looked past him. "Where is the patient?" As though summoned by professional insult, Alder appeared from behind the chair, carrying Nolan's missing sock. Camille crouched without reaching for him. "Well, there you are." Alder stopped. He looked at her, looked at Nolan, then approached Camille cautiously, the sock still hanging from his mouth. She held out the back of one hand. Alder sniffed. His tail gave one tentative movement. Camille looked at the sock. "Critical condition?" "Terminal," Nolan said. The sock never had a chance. That earned a quiet laugh. It surprised him how much he liked the sound. Camille examined Alder near the stove where the morning light was better. She worked patiently. No unnecessary restraints, no exaggerated baby voice. Her hands moved with the assurance of someone who understood that frightened or uncertain animals often responded best to people who behaved as though nothing terrible was about to happen. She checked Alder's mouth, teeth, gums, ears, eyes, listened to his heart, pressed carefully along his abdomen, ran her fingers over his ribs and limbs. Alder objected only when she tried to look between his toes, at which point he attempted to eat the stethoscope. Camille pulled it away. "Strong medical opinions. He gets those from Wyatt." From the porch, Wyatt said, "I heard that. You were supposed to." Alder was thin enough that Camille could count several ribs easily beneath the puppy coat. But there was no alarming loss of muscle and no evidence of prolonged starvation. She sat back on her heels. "He's underweight, not dangerously. I'd like him gaining slowly, not all at once." Nolan glanced toward the 3 food bags stacked by the counter. Camille followed his eyes. 3? Research, of course. She smiled but spared him further humiliation. He doesn't have any old fractures, no suspicious bruising. Coat needs nutrition more than anything else. Hydration's better than I expected. So nobody hurt him. Camille's expression softened. Nothing I'm seeing suggests that. Mostly inconsistent care. Probably passed around too much. Fed whatever was convenient. Nolan looked at Alder. The distinction mattered. Neglect did not always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it was simply the absence of anyone staying responsible long enough. Camille gave Nolan feeding instructions, vaccination recommendations, and a warning about over-exercising a large breed puppy. Short walks, let him sleep. Don't make him earn being here. Nolan looked at her. I wasn't planning to. Good. Her tone carried no accusation, only the boundary. That made him listen. She was about to pack away the stethoscope when her hand paused over Alder's shoulders. Did the seller mention a chip? No. Camille reached for a small handheld scanner from her medical bag. Let's check. Nolan leaned against the kitchen counter. Alder sat between them, more interested in a loose thread on Camille's vest than in the procedure. She passed the scanner over his shoulders. Nothing. Again. A faint electronic chirp. Camille stopped. Nolan straightened. What? Maybe nothing. She moved the scanner more slowly. Another chirp. This time a partial code flickered across the small display. Camille frowned. A17, what does that mean? By itself. Not much. She scanned again. A few additional characters appeared, then vanished. The prefix was unfamiliar to her. Not one of the common county shelter or private pet registries she used every week. Camille stared at the screen, then at Alder. The puppy had been trying to chew her vest zipper only seconds earlier. Now, for no obvious reason, he had gone very still. His head was raised. His uneven ears aimed toward the scanner, not frightened. Listening. Camille lowered the device. Alder relaxed immediately. She raised it again. His attention returned. Nolan watched the small change. What is it? Camille glanced at him. I don't know yet. That answer should have been reassuring. Instead, something cold moved quietly through Nolan's stomach. The scanner chirped once more. Alder looked toward Nolan. For a strange moment, the cabin seemed too small around the 3 of them. Not because anything dangerous had entered it, because something from before Nolan had ever seen Alder at the flea market appeared to have followed him home. Camille switched off the scanner. I'll run the prefix when I get back to the clinic. Nolan's response came too quickly. Does somebody own him? Silence. Camille looked directly at him. Nolan realized what he had asked. Not where did he come from? Not what program is that? Not why is the chip strange? Does somebody own him? A question about losing the puppy. Camille did not embarrass him by pointing it out. If he's registered, we'll find out what the record actually says first. Nolan nodded. Alder stood, wandered over, and sat against his boot. Camille watched that too. She packed her scanner. Before leaving, she pointed at the 3 bags of dog food. Use the large breed formula. Nolan nodded. The others. Dedate them. Wyatt stepped through the door. I know a dog. No. Alder looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Alder. Camille laughed again. By early afternoon, the cabin had become too quiet. Nolan told himself that was why he took Alder toward the eastern loop of the lake trail. Not because he was thinking about the scanner. Not because the phrase, does somebody own him, had been repeating in his head. The trail curved through white pine and birch, descending gently toward a narrow marshy section before climbing again through granite outcrops. Alder moved more slowly than he had that morning. Nolan kept the walk easy. A breeze off the lake carried the smell of wet leaves and cold water. Half a mile from the cabin, Alder stopped, not at a squirrel, not at a branch. His nose lifted, then lowered toward the downhill side of the trail. Nolan continued 2 steps. Alder stayed. You coming? The puppy sniffed beneath a fern, moved several feet downslope, stopped, looked toward Nolan, then went farther. Nolan frowned. Alder. The puppy returned uphill 2 steps, then immediately turned and went back toward the slope. No barking, no pulling, just persistence. Nolan followed. The hillside dropped only 15 or 20 feet before flattening near a line of brush. Alder squeezed between 2 young birches. Nolan heard a voice. Hello? He stopped. Who's there? Down here. A man sat against a fallen log below the trail. He appeared to be in his late 60s, thin and long-limbed, with silver hair escaping beneath a navy knit cap and a narrow, clean-shaven face reddened by the cold. He wore an orange hiking shell, tan pants, and 1 boot that he was clearly trying not to move. Pain had tightened his mouth, but embarrassment seemed to bother him nearly as much. My name's Harold Mercer, he said. I seem to have temporarily misplaced my dignity. Nolan crouched. Ankle? Stepped on wet stone. Foot went one direction. The rest of me filed an objection. Nolan checked the ankle without manipulating it excessively. Swelling, pain, no obvious deformity. Can you put weight on it? Technically. Meaning no. Meaning I tried and learned something. Alder approached Harold cautiously. Harold looked at him. That's your dog? Nolan glanced at the puppy. The question still felt unexpectedly new. Yeah. Alder sniffed Harold's sleeve, then sat down. Harold smiled. Your puppy found me. Nolan slid Harold's arm across his shoulder and helped him stand. Yesterday he found a sock. He's expanding his portfolio. Harold laughed, then winced when he shifted his ankle. They took the climb slowly. Alder followed close behind rather than ranging ahead. At the trail, Nolan called Wyatt on the radio. 15 minutes later, the old green pickup arrived at the nearest access point. Wyatt helped Harold into the passenger seat while complaining that people over 60 should know better than to challenge wet rocks. Harold reminded him that Wyatt was over 70. Wyatt replied that this only proved his expertise. Before they left, Harold leaned out of the open window. Take care of that dog. Nolan looked down. Alder had collapsed onto the pine needles beside his boot, tongue visible, exhausted by what had been a modest adventure for everyone except a 15-week-old puppy. I plan to. The answer escaped before Nolan considered it. Harold smiled. Wyatt heard it. Neither commented. Nolan carried Alder the last half-mile home. The puppy was warm against his chest, surprisingly limp in sleep, one large paw resting against the red and navy flannel beneath Nolan's open-field jacket. Halfway back, Alder's head slipped sideways. Nolan adjusted his hold automatically. He had carried men under fire, carried packs until his shoulders bled, dragged people through water and rubble. Yet carrying a sleeping puppy required a different kind of attention. Everything about Alder seemed temporary at that age. The soft ears, the oversized paws, the fragile weight, the unquestioning sleep. At the cabin porch, Nolan stopped. He could have gone inside immediately. Instead, he stood beneath the birches while the afternoon sun turned the leaves bright yellow above him. Alder slept through all of it. Nolan looked down at him. $5. No papers, nobody came back. He did not like how much those words bothered him now. He carried Alder inside and laid him carefully on the blanket. The puppy woke just enough to turn once before falling asleep again. Nolan sat in the chair. He told himself he was waiting for Camille's call because the chip mattered. That was true. It simply wasn't the whole truth. The phone rang shortly before sunset. Camille. Nolan answered on the second ring. What did you find? No, hello. Hello. What did you find? She made a small sound that might have been amusement. I traced the prefix. Nolan looked toward Alder. The puppy was sleeping on his side, near the stove, rear paw twitching through some private dream. Camille continued. It belongs to a working dog registry, specifically the North Star Wilderness Search and Rescue Development Program. Nolan sat straighter. Search and Rescue Development Program. Puppies, young dogs, breeding records, early assessment. A17 is in their system. What does it say? There was the brief sound of keyboard keys on Camille's end. North Star A17, male German Shepherd. Transfer initiated during emergency relocation. Nolan waited. And the destination field was never completed. He frowned. What does that mean? Exactly what it sounds like. He was supposed to go somewhere. The record never says where he arrived, so he's missing. Administratively, yes. Nolan looked at Alder again. The puppy's remaining soft ear had folded over his eye. He looked less like a mystery than an animal who might wake shortly and attempt to eat furniture. Camille spoke again. There's one more line. Nolan said nothing. Damn identification. His mother? Yes. Alder stirred, raised his head. Nolan watched him. What name? Vega. Nolan had never heard it. Who's Vega? Camille was quiet for a moment. When she answered, the humor was gone from her voice. A search and rescue German Shepherd. Another pause. One that disappeared 7 weeks ago. The stove gave a soft metallic click. Outside, evening light faded over Lake Larkspur. Alder yawned, pushed himself awkwardly to his feet, and wandered toward Nolan as though none of this had anything to do with him. He sat beside the chair. Nolan lowered one hand to the puppy's head. Somewhere beyond Silver Crown, a dog named Vega had vanished, and somehow, 7 weeks later, her son had ended up beneath a $5 sign at a flea market. For the first time since bringing Alder home, Nolan understood that the little dog's past might not simply be empty. It might have been misplaced. The morning after Camille's call, Nolan found himself driving north of Coppervale on a road he had never had a reason to use. The pavement narrowed quickly, passing between tall white pines and stands of birch already brightening toward gold. Lake Larkspur disappeared behind a ridge, replaced by smaller ponds scattered through the forest like pieces of broken sky. Alder sat on the passenger seat in his dark red puppy harness. One oversized paw braced against the edge of the cushion whenever the truck rounded a bend. Camille followed in her Subaru. Nolan had agreed to the trip for one reason only. Camille had said the man they were meeting had spent more than 20 years working with wilderness search dogs and had once been part of the North Star program. That did not mean Nolan was comfortable with it. He glanced toward Alder. The puppy had become fascinated with the windshield wipers even though they were not moving. Nolan tapped the steering wheel. "You don't know what any of this means." Alder looked at him, then sneezed. "Good, makes two of us." The address led to a modest property beside an old county access road. A weathered cedar house sat at one end of a long clearing, and behind it stood a low training barn with a faded green roof. Beyond the barn, Nolan could see sections of old agility equipment half swallowed by grass. Platforms, low ramps, a tunnel, and a line of wooden poles. None of it looked active anymore. There were no rows of barking dogs, no uniformed handlers. Only wind through spruce branches and a weathered sign near the barn door that read, North Star K9 Training, Retired Facility. A tall, lean man waited beside the building. Everett Hale was 67 and carried age in a way that suggested it had negotiated with him rather than defeated him. He stood around 5'11", with narrow hips, straight shoulders, and large hands marked by years of rope, cold metal, and dog leads. His face was long and lightly angular, lined deeply around the forehead and eyes. Short silver hair covered his head evenly, and a few days of gray-white beard shadow softened his jaw without hiding its shape. His eyes were brown-gray and remarkably still. He wore a dark forest green canvas jacket over a pale gray Henley, brown cargo pants, heavy dark brown hiking boots, and an old whistle on a cord tucked mostly beneath his shirt. There was nothing theatrical about him, no booming greeting, no instant claim that Alder was special. That made Nolan like him before he intended to. Camille parked beside the truck and stepped out. Everett nodded toward her. "Doctor, retired troublemaker. Only from payroll." His gaze moved to Nolan. "You must be Varden." "Nolan." Everett offered a hand. His grip was firm but brief. Then he looked at Alder. The puppy was still sitting in the truck. Everett did not approach, did not crouch, did not whistle. He simply watched. Alder looked back. After several seconds, the puppy hopped his front paws toward the open door, misjudged the drop, reconsidered, and sat again. Everett's mouth shifted faintly. He knows his limits. He discovers them repeatedly. Good age for it. Nolan lifted Alder down. The puppy landed, shook himself, and immediately became distracted by a pine cone. Everett watched him wrestle with it. "How old?" 15 weeks, approximately, Camille's estimate. Everett nodded. "And underweight?" "Improving." Camille joined them. "He's healthy enough. I'd like a few more pounds over time, not overnight." Everett still had not touched Alder. Nolan noticed. Most people who liked dogs seemed unable to resist reaching for them. Everett behaved more like someone meeting another person, waiting for an introduction. Alder eventually abandoned the pine cone and wandered toward him. He sniffed Everett's boots, then the lower edge of the canvas jacket. Everett turned slightly sideways and lowered one hand. Alder sniffed the fingers. His tail moved once. Only then did Everett scratch lightly beneath his jaw. "That'll do." Nolan frowned. "That tells you something?" "Tells me he doesn't hate me." Camille smiled. High praise. Everett straightened. People expect old trainers to look at a puppy for 30 seconds and discover destiny. His brown-gray eyes moved toward Nolan. "Mostly we discover puppies." That earned him another point. They went into the old training barn. Inside, one side had been converted into a quiet office. Shelves held binders, old field manuals, framed photographs, rolled maps, and plastic storage boxes labeled with years. The other side of the building still resembled a training space, though the scent of wood dust had replaced the smell of working dogs. Alder immediately found a cardboard box beneath a desk. He put his head inside. The box tipped. The puppy backed out wearing it. Camille laughed. Everett did not. He observed Alder work the box off his head by stepping backward and shaking until it fell away. Problem-solving could use refinement. Nolan folded his arms. He's been developing a strong relationship with cardboard. Everett finally smiled. It transformed his face briefly, making him look several years younger. Then the observation began, not a test. Everett was careful about that distinction. He let Alder wander, rolled a soft rubber ball across the floor. The puppy chased it with enthusiasm, overshot it, turned, picked it up, then forgot why he had wanted it and dropped it near a table leg. Everett made a small note. A metal water bottle slipped accidentally from Camille's bag and struck the floor. Alder startled. His shoulders dropped. One paw shifted backward, but within seconds his nose moved toward the bottle. Curiosity replaced alarm. Everett made another note. "Good recovery." Nolan glanced at him. Meaning, startling is normal, especially at his age. Recovery tells me more. Alder sniffed the bottle, decided it offered nothing edible, and moved on. Everett watched his gait. The puppy's hindquarters were still slightly loose in the awkward way of a fast-growing shepherd. His front paws seemed to arrive at destinations before the rest of his body had made a decision. Nothing about him looked trained. That was important to Nolan. He did not want a room full of people turning a 15-week-old animal into a story before the dog had even learned how to walk past a squirrel without forgetting civilization. Everett seemed to understand. He's not operational material. Camille looked amused. He's 4 months old. Exactly. Nolan studied the older trainer. You knew his mother. The change in Everett was small, but there. His eyes left Alder and settled on a framed photograph on the wall. Yes, he crossed the office and removed it from its hook. The photograph showed a mature female German shepherd standing beside a man on a granite ridge. The dog was perhaps 6 years old in the picture, full-grown and powerfully built without being heavy. Her coat was black and tan, darker across the saddle and shoulders, with rich copper brown along her legs and chest. Both ears stood upright. Her muzzle carried just the beginning of gray around the lower edges, and her dark amber eyes were focused somewhere beyond the camera. She wore a weathered red search and rescue harness. She was Vega, Everett said. Nolan looked at the photograph. The handler beside her was a man in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, lean and fit in the practical way of someone who had spent years climbing rough country. His face was long, cheekbones clearly defined, jaw moderate rather than square. Light brown eyes gave him a thoughtful expression beneath short light brown hair already beginning to silver. A short brown and gray beard covered his jaw. In the photograph, he wore a navy outdoor jacket and had one hand resting loosely on Vega's shoulder. Daniel Kerr? Nolan asked. Everett nodded. 45 now. Wilderness handler most of his adult life. Patient man. Better with dogs than with paperwork, which is not unusual in that profession. There was affection in Everett's voice, and something heavier beneath it. Vega was his third working dog. Best one? No. Everett replaced the frame carefully on his desk. People always want a ranking. He considered the question. She was the dog who fit him best. That answer stayed with Nolan. Everett sat behind the desk. Vega wasn't flashy. She wouldn't beat every dog in speed. Wasn't the hardest driving dog I ever handled. What made her good? Judgment. Everett leaned back. If scent went bad, she didn't panic. If weather shifted, she adjusted. If a frightened subject screamed at her, she didn't take it personally. Camille sat on the corner of another desk. Everett's eyes returned to the photograph, and she always looked back. Nolan said nothing. She'd work ahead, Everett continued, but not as if Daniel were luggage. Every so often she'd turn around and check him. Not because she was insecure. It was part of how she worked. She needed to know where her person was before she committed farther. Alder, meanwhile, had rediscovered the cardboard box. He dragged it across the floor by one torn flap. The sound made everyone glance toward him. The puppy succeeded in pulling it halfway across the room. Then the flap tore loose. Alder stumbled backward, surprised by the sudden victory. Camille covered a smile with one hand. Nolan shook his head. Everett watched. Alder trotted toward the far side of the training room with the piece of cardboard. He made it perhaps 15 feet. Stopped. His head came up. He turned. His amber eyes found Nolan. For a second, the room went very quiet. Not supernatural, not impossible. Just a puppy checking where the man was. Then Alder resumed his private war with the cardboard. Everett did not say anything. Neither did Nolan. There was no need. The strange part was not that Alder had copied something his mother once did. No one in that room believed memory passed through blood like a map. The strange part was simpler. A habit Everett had remembered because it once defined a missing rescue dog was now sitting, clumsy and young, inside her son. And Nolan suddenly wondered how many pieces of a life could survive without anyone understanding that they had survived at all. Everett let the silence dissolve naturally. Then he opened one of the storage boxes beneath the desk. Vega had a litter late summer. Nolan's attention sharpened. North Star breeding program? Yes. Planned breeding, health screened, working lineage on both sides. He pulled out a folder. A17 was one of 6. Camille leaned closer, so 15 weeks tracks. Almost exactly. Everett opened the record. At 8 weeks, the litter was weaned. Puppies stayed in development housing. Vega had been out of full work during pregnancy and nursing. Obviously. Nolan looked toward Alder. The puppy was now lying on the ruined box. So what happened 7 weeks ago? Everett did not answer immediately. He turned several pages. When Vega returned to conditioning, Daniel started small. Walks, short scent games, trail exposure. Nothing strenuous. He pointed toward a laminated map pinned to a corkboard. It showed the forest district north and east of Silver Crown. One area was marked with a faded orange grid. Sector 14. Nolan stepped closer. What was it? Post-fire management zone. Everett tapped the boundary. A wildfire had moved through sections of this district the previous year. Not catastrophic everywhere, patchy. Some stands burned hard, some lightly, some barely at all. After the fire, certain areas had been closed while foresters assessed damaged timber and marked what could be removed under salvage permits. Sector 14 was one of those areas. By the time Vega returned to light work, public access remained restricted. Authorized survey and forestry personnel could enter. Ordinary hikers could not. Daniel took her along an approved conditioning route outside the closed line. Everett said, "What changed?" "Vega." Everett traced a finger near the edge of the map. She caught human scent. Inside the closed section? Yes. Could been authorized staff. Could have. Everett looked at Nolan. That's why Daniel didn't treat it like a crime scene. There was no reason to. At first, Vega worked the scent naturally. Daniel allowed her to follow because short trailing exercises were exactly what he was rebuilding. The track crossed into Sector 14. Daniel knew the closure boundary, but he also knew authorized crews used the area. He followed a limited distance. Then he noticed something. A boundary stake had been removed from one position and driven into another. Not far, maybe 50 yards. Then another. "The permit line?" Nolan asked. "Salvage boundary." Everett nodded. Daniel photographed the stakes. Farther in, he saw trees marked for salvage that did not show meaningful fire damage. Healthy trunks, full crowns, green cambium, and beyond them, heavy logging equipment. Who owned it? Equipment markings identified North Crown Forest Recovery. The name meant nothing to Nolan. Everett continued. Local forestry contractor, post-fire salvage, hazardous tree removal, road work. Established company. Were they permitted inside Sector 14? Parts of it. Everett's expression hardened slightly. The question was whether they were operating beyond the permitted line. Nolan looked at the map. "You said Daniel found this 7 weeks ago. Why wasn't it investigated?" "Because seeing something questionable and proving it are different things." That sounded like a sentence Sheriff Dana Whitmore would later appreciate. Everett explained that Daniel took photographs and recorded GPS points. He intended to verify the official map before filing a formal report. Nothing about his initial discovery proved deliberate fraud. Markers were sometimes moved accidentally. Maps were sometimes updated. Forestry operations could be messy. Daniel wanted evidence, not suspicion. Nolan understood that instinct. He also understood how easily waiting for certainty could become regret. What happened to Vega? Everett closed the folder. 4 days later, weather moved in. A windstorm struck the district faster than forecast. Not a hurricane. Nothing dramatic enough for national news. But northern forests did not require extraordinary weather to become dangerous. Saturated soil, 40-mile-per-hour gusts, shallow-rooted trees. A service road near the north side of Sector 14 partially collapsed after drainage overflowed. Daniel had returned to the area, this time using an authorized access road, intending to confirm his previous coordinates before making the report. Vega was with him. A tree came down. Daniel avoided the trunk itself but slipped down an unstable bank. He struck his head and injured his right leg. Vega was thrown or forced away during the slide. Nobody knew exactly which. Daniel remembered calling her, then very little. A road crew found him several hours later. Vega? Gone. Search teams worked the area after conditions improved. Tracks had been damaged by rain. Drainage water moved through the lower ground. Vega's working harness was not found. Neither was the dog. Nolan stared at the map. The word gone bothered him in ways he did not want to inspect too closely. Everett apparently noticed. He changed direction. The same storm damaged part of North Star's puppy housing. Camille folded her arms. That's where A17 enters the transfer chain. Everett nodded. The puppies were safe, but a roof section was compromised and power went down. We had emergency fosters available, so staff moved the litter. He found another document. 6 puppies. 6 temporary destinations. His finger went down the list. A12, complete. A13, complete. 14, 15, 16. Then, A17, no destination. Nolan's jaw tightened. How do you lose a puppy on paper? Same way you lose anything on paper. Everett's tone held no humor. People are tired. Radios fail. Somebody writes something on a temporary kennel card and assumes someone else entered it. Vehicles change. One foster takes 2 dogs instead of 1. One dog gets handed off at a clinic. He closed the file. A missing field doesn't mean someone stole him, but it means no one knew where he went. Yes. Nolan looked at Alder. The puppy had rolled onto his back, all 4 paws loosely in the air. asleep on top of the demolished cardboard box. There was something absurd about discussing lost records while the subject snored 3 yards away. Nolan felt anger anyway. Not explosive anger, the slower kind. A living creature had moved from one pair of hands to another until the line broke. Everyone involved might have meant well. The result had still been a $5 sign. Everett seemed to read part of that thought. Don't make a villain before you have one. Nolan looked at him. Wasn't planning to. Good. A pause. Because anger loves unfinished stories. Nolan did not answer. He knew that better than most people. Camille walked toward Alder and nudged the cardboard away from his nose so he could breathe more comfortably. The puppy did not wake. Everett watched Nolan watch him. You thinking about training? No, the answer came immediately. Everett nodded once. Good. Nolan had expected argument. What? He's 15 weeks. Everett gestured toward Alder. He should eat, sleep, play, bite inappropriate objects, discover gravity. Camille smiled. Excellent curriculum. If he has working potential, you won't lose it because you let him be young. Nolan felt something in his shoulders release. He had not realized he was waiting for Everett to claim the puppy for some larger purpose. He's not Vega, Nolan said. Everett met his eyes. No, then, very simply, he's Alder. Nolan looked away first. That was the moment he decided he trusted Everett Hale. Not because the man knew dogs, because he understood the danger of asking the living to become monuments to the missing. Before they left, Everett stopped beside one of the filing cabinets. Wait. He opened the second drawer. Several folders sat inside, labeled by handler name. He pulled Daniel Kerr's. I kept copies of conditioning notes. He searched through a handful of pages. One sheet had a handwritten notation near the bottom. Everett read silently. Then again. Camille noticed the change in his face. What? Everett handed the page to Nolan. The writing was neat but hurried. Fresh human track inside closed sector 14. Boundary marker displacement observed. Healthy timber marked for salvage beyond mapped line. North Crown equipment present beyond permitted area. GPS bata verification pending. Below it, D. Nolan read the note twice. The important word was not North Crown. Not yet. It was pending. Daniel had known enough to question what he saw. Not enough to finish proving it. Then the storm had stopped him. Everett leaned back against the filing cabinet. This copy never went anywhere. Why? Because it wasn't a formal report. It was a training note attached to Vega's conditioning log. Camille looked toward the sleeping puppy. So when Vega disappeared, the note disappeared with the rest of the unfinished work. Everett nodded. Nolan folded the page carefully but did not put it into his pocket. Who gets this? Sheriff. Everett's answer came immediately. No freelance heroics. Nolan gave him a flat look. Do I look enthusiastic? You look trained. Everett closed the drawer. Sometimes that's worse. By late afternoon, Nolan and Camille were sitting in a small interview room at the Copperville Sheriff's Office, while Everett's copied records lay inside a clear document sleeve on the metal table. The woman across from them was Sheriff Dana Whitmore. Dana was 48, about 5'8", with a lean, fit build, and the upright posture of someone who had spent years making herself difficult to intimidate. Her face was slightly long, with a clear jawline and sharp but controlled features. Pale steel blue eyes moved carefully between people and documents. Her lightly sun-browned skin contrasted with ash-blonde hair threaded with silver, cut in a blunt bob at jaw length and tucked neatly behind one ear. She wore a brown olive sheriff's uniform beneath a matching duty jacket, dark brown uniform trousers, a standard duty belt, and black waterproof boots. Dana did not carry authority theatrically. She simply assumed everyone in the room understood that it existed. She read Daniel's field note. Then the transfer records. Then Everett's brief written explanation. Alder lay beneath Nolan's chair, exhausted from the day. Dana placed both hands flat on the file. You understand this isn't proof of criminal activity? Yes, Nolan said. Camille remained quiet. Dana continued. A moved boundary marker could have explanations. Equipment outside a line could have explanations. An incomplete note from an injured handler is exactly that. An incomplete note. Nolan's blue-gray eyes stayed on hers. But it's enough to look. Dana held his gaze for a second. Maybe. She glanced beneath the table. Alder was chewing quietly on the corner of Nolan's bootlace. Dana looked back at Nolan. Your puppy isn't evidence. I know. Her expression suggested she was deciding whether she believed him. Then she tapped Daniel's note once with her index finger. But his mother may have found some. The room settled into silence. Nolan looked down. Alder had abandoned the bootlace and was now asleep against Nolan's boot, entirely unaware of search programs, missing handlers, forest boundaries, or the name North Crown. And Nolan finally understood the shape of the problem. The mystery was not hidden inside the puppy. Alder had not carried an answer out of the forest. He had carried something simpler, a reason for people to reopen a file they had stopped looking at. Sometimes that was enough to change where a story went next. Sheriff Dana Whitmore waited until the interview room door had closed before telling Nolan exactly what he was not going to do. "You are not going into Sector 14. Nolan sat across from her with one forearm resting on the metal table. His olive field jacket remained zipped halfway over the red and dark navy flannel beneath it, and the old military watch on his left wrist caught a pale line of fluorescent light whenever he moved. "I didn't say I was." "You were thinking loudly." Camille Rowan sat beside him, hiding a smile behind a paper cup of courthouse coffee. Dana continued, "You are not following North Crown trucks. You are not parking near their yard with binoculars. You are not confronting employees. You are not testing locked gates to see whether they are actually locked." Nolan's blue-gray eyes narrowed. "That last one feels unnecessarily specific. I've met men who used to do your job. Not all of us open gates. No, some of you remove hinges." Camille lowered her cup. "I'm staying out of this." Dana ignored her. The sheriff had already changed Nolan's understanding of authority in one important way. She did not use it to dominate a room. She used it to limit what could go wrong inside one. At 48, Dana carried herself with a controlled physical confidence that made unnecessary gestures seem wasteful. Her ash-blonde hair, threaded with silver, curved along her jaw in a blunt bob, tucked neatly behind one ear. Her pale steel-blue eyes rarely wandered when someone spoke. She wore the same brown olive sheriff's uniform and duty jacket Nolan had seen before. Dark brown trousers fitted cleanly over black waterproof boots, her standard duty belt resting squarely at her hips. She looked at him now without hostility. That almost made the restriction harder to argue with. "I've started checking the public forestry records," she said. "That's what happens next." Nolan leaned back. "And if records disappear, then someone investigates why. If equipment moves, we document it legally. If somebody's looking," Dana folded her hands, "then we try very hard not to make them know before we understand what we're looking at." Nolan disliked patience when other people controlled it. In another life, patience had meant lying still in freezing surf, waiting for a window that might last 7 seconds. That kind he understood. This kind required trust. He was less practiced at that. Dana studied him. Keepability and permission are not the same thing. The sentence landed harder than Nolan expected. He looked toward the narrow window overlooking the parking lot. Outside, Alder sat in the front seat of Nolan's truck with Wyatt Bell, who had volunteered to supervise the prisoner and had almost certainly smuggled food into the arrangement. Nolan returned his attention to Dana. "I know the difference. I believe you do. Then why the speech?" "Because knowing a difference and respecting it when you're angry are two separate skills." Camille glanced at Nolan. He did not return the look. Dana slid a photocopied schedule across the table. "There's a community trail maintenance day Saturday near the Western Silver Crown Loop. North Crown is one of the sponsors." Nolan looked at the page. "You're telling me to go where they are? I'm telling you not to avoid your normal life because a company name now bothers you. That sounds philosophical. It's logistical. You already volunteered for pump inspection." Wyatt had volunteered him technically. Dana stood. "Go fix the pump and ignore them. Observe your surroundings the same way you always do." That wording Nolan could live with. Saturday arrived clear and colder. The maintenance site sat in a broad clearing near a junction of 3 recreational trails, where a picnic shelter, storage shed, and weathered information kiosk stood among white pines. Morning sunlight flashed off dew along the grass. Volunteers unloaded rakes, shovels, brush cutters, drainage pipe, and boxes of orange trail markers. Alder had recently graduated from looking fragile to looking merely young. The ribs that had once been too easy to see were beginning to disappear beneath healthy weight. His black and tan coat had taken on a softer shine, though tufts of puppy fur still stood unevenly around his neck and shoulders. One ear was now nearly upright most of the time. The other continued to lean sideways whenever curiosity exceeded concentration. His dark, red adjustable puppy harness fit more comfortably than it had the previous week. Nolan kept him on a short lead near the edge of the work area. The puppy had already tried to eat one wood chip and investigate a bucket. "You're contributing," Nolan told him. Alder sat on one rear paw, a black pickup with polished chrome pulled into the clearing. Several volunteers waved. The man who stepped out was Grant Hollowell. He was perhaps 54, around 6 feet tall, with the balanced, moderately strong build of someone who had once done physical forestry work before spending more time behind contracts and steering wheels. His face was rectangular, jaw solid, features approachable rather than severe. Gray-brown eyes sat beneath straight brows. His skin held a light outdoor tan. Salt and pepper hair had been combed neatly back from his forehead, and he was clean-shaven. Grant wore a tan work jacket over a navy polo, charcoal work pants, clean brown leather boots, and a matching brown belt. He looked more like the owner of a successful regional contracting company than the villain Nolan's instincts would have preferred. That mattered. Grant shook hands with a Forest Service volunteer, clapped an older road worker lightly on the shoulder, and knew 3 people by first name before he had crossed half the clearing. A stack of bottled water and donated work gloves came from the bed of his truck. North Crown pays for those every fall, Wyatt murmured beside Nolan. Wyatt had arrived wearing his brown canvas chore jacket, pale denim shirt, dark khaki work pants, worn boots, and faded forest green cap. His silver mustache moved when he spoke. Doesn't prove anything. I didn't say it did. Nolan watched Grant help unload the gloves himself. People like him, people like jobs. Wyatt glanced sideways. Sometimes they're the same thing. Grant eventually noticed Nolan. He approached without hesitation. You're Varden, right? Nolan shook his hand. Depends who's asking. Grant laughed easily. Hollowell, Grant. His grip was firm, dry, confident without becoming competitive. I've heard you've kept half the Silver Crown maintenance list from becoming a lawsuit. Only half. The other half belongs to county government. I don't interfere with tradition. His attention dropped to Alder. The puppy had moved closer to Nolan's right leg, not hiding, simply choosing familiarity. Grant crouched only slightly rather than reaching directly. Good-looking shepherd. Alder watched him. Grant extended 2 fingers. Alder leaned forward enough to sniff the air, then stepped back until one shoulder brushed Nolan's boot. No growl, no flattened ears, no mystical judgment. The clearing was crowded with unfamiliar voices, tools, scents, boots, engines, and moving people. Nolan did not interpret it, neither did Grant. Shy? Grant asked. Delective, smart dog. He hasn't demonstrated that consistently. Grant smiled. You working him? No. Good. The answer surprised Nolan. Grant stood. Too young. Everybody sees shepherd ears and wants a finished dog by Christmas. He nodded once toward Alder. Let him be stupid while he still has permission. Then someone called Grant from near the supply trailer. He excused himself and walked away. Nolan stared after him. Wyatt said, disappointed? In what? He didn't twirl a mustache. Nolan looked at Wyatt's thick silver one. You've already filled the position. Wyatt smiled into his coffee. The workday progressed normally. That normality bothered Nolan more than open hostility would have. North Crown employees helped repair water bars along a sloped trail. Grant spent part of the morning carrying drainage pipe with everyone else. He talked to volunteers, donated lunch, asked Wyatt whether an old culvert still clogged every spring. Nothing about him suggested a man protecting a secret. Then Lena Hartwell arrived in a county maintenance truck and changed the shape of the morning. Lena was 31, around 5'7", with a compact athletic build shaped by years of hauling tools up hills rather than gym routines. Her face was slightly round with lightly raised cheekbones and quick green eyes. A scatter of freckles crossed sun-browned skin. Auburn red hair was pulled into a low ponytail beneath the collar of her brick-red hoodie. Over the hoodie she wore a yellow and gray reflective work vest with a black marker clipped permanently into one front pocket, charcoal cargo work pants, and dark brown waterproof boots. She moved with the efficiency of someone who believed standing still should require justification. Varden. She pointed at the trail map in Nolan's hand. You're holding that upside down. Nolan looked at it. It's oriented to terrain. It's oriented to Australia. Wyatt laughed. Nolan turned the map once. Alder immediately approached Lena. She crouched. Hello, tiny management consultant. Alder sniffed the marker in her pocket. No. Lena covered it with one hand. You eat my Sharpie. You're doing the drainage reports. Nolan said he'd improve them. Rude. She straightened. The humor remained in her face, but her attention shifted when she saw Grant speaking near the shelter. You know him? Hollowell? Yeah. Met him 10 minutes ago. Lena nodded. She said nothing more until Grant moved toward the eastern trail with 2 volunteers. Then she glanced at Nolan. You working with Dana on something? Nolan's expression changed. Why? That is not a no. You should ask Dana. I did. And? She told me if I remembered anything useful, I should call her. Lena slid the marker from her pocket and rolled it across her fingers. I might remember something useful. Nolan did not prompt her. He had learned that people often filled silence more accurately when no one hurried them. Lena looked toward the trees. Late summer, maybe 6 weeks ago. I was finishing a culvert inspection on Northridge Road. Near Sector 14? Not inside it. Her voice lost some of its speed. North Crown had a lowboy trailer going north after 10 at night. Could been emergency work. That's what I assumed. She tapped the marker against her palm. Then I saw another one 2 weeks later. Same road, after a heavy rain. What equipment? Tracked harvester first time, loader second. Permits? I don't see contract dispatch sheets unless county work overlaps ours, she frowned. Maybe there was nothing wrong with it. Nolan glanced toward Grant again. Lena noticed. I'm not accusing him. I know. Good. Because around here North Crown signs paychecks for people I went to high school with. That was the first time Nolan understood the social weight of the company. Grant Hollowell was not an outsider exploiting Copperville. North Crown belonged to Copperville. Its trucks were part of the roads. Its workers bought breakfast at the diner. Its donations paid for gear. If something was wrong, the truth would not arrive cleanly. It would arrive with neighbors attached. Lena pulled out her phone. I'll send Dana the dates I remember. Do that. She looked at Nolan. And you? Fixing a pump. Lena stared. You look emotionally devastated. I'll recover. She smiled. Then her gaze dropped to Alder, who had fallen asleep beside a coil of unused hose in the middle of the conversation. Clearly your security detail is overwhelmed. Nolan looked down. Alder was snoring softly. He's union. 3 days later, Dana called Nolan back to her office. This time maps covered the interview table, not field notes, official records. Dana had obtained a public copy of the initial post-fire assessment map and a later map attached to the final salvage authorization. Nolan stood beside her rather than sitting. Camille was not there. Neither was Wyatt. Alder remained home because the sheriff's office had already survived enough puppy chewing. Dana pointed to a shaded region. This is the original damage assessment. Burn severity was marked in colors. Deep damage in several patches, moderate damage elsewhere, and long fingers of healthy forest between them. She placed a transparent overlay above it. Final salvage boundary. Nolan leaned closer. Most lines followed the original assessment, but not all. One section pushed farther east, another bent uphill. A third extended around a stand that the initial map had shown as lightly affected. How far? Nolan asked. Depends where. Dana measured one section, roughly 600 feet at the widest discrepancy. That's not a rounding error. No. Updated assessment? Possible. Approved amendment? I haven't found one yet. Dana's tone mattered. Not there wasn't one. She had not found one. Nolan looked at the maps again. One set of lines described what the fire had damaged. The other described what someone had later been allowed to remove. They should not have been identical. Forestry assessment evolved. Hazard trees were found later. Access concerns changed. Yet the disagreement had direction. It moved toward intact timber. Dana placed the tip of her pen on one coordinate. This marker should have been here. She moved the pen uphill. Final survey shows it here. Nolan measured the gap visually. What's between them? Dana pulled out an aerial photograph. A dense stand of mature white pine filled the space. Green crowns, straight trunks, no visible burn scar. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Dana said quietly, an irregular line is paperwork. Her pen remained over the green trees. A line that keeps bending toward valuable timber becomes a question. Still, Dana refused to call it proof. That frustrated Nolan. It also made him trust her more. She requested county survey records, checked amendment logs, contacted a forestry compliance officer without accusing North Crown of wrongdoing. Lena sent the dates of the late-night equipment movements. Everything went into a file, slowly, carefully. No one kicked down a door. No one announced a conspiracy. Nolan returned to Silver Crown. Life there had continued while a line on a map became suspicious. Alder gained another pound. Camille arrived one afternoon with a small veterinary scale and set it on the cabin floor. Alder treated the scale like an enemy platform. He placed one front paw on it, retreated, barked once. Camille sat cross-legged beside the device. She wore the same moss green and cream flannel, charcoal veterinary vest, dark jeans, and waterproof brown boots. Her chestnut hair, touched with copper in the afternoon light, was tied low behind her neck. It doesn't bite. Nolan leaned against the kitchen counter. He's heard that before. From who? Me? Before what? Bath. Camille looked at Alder. My condolences. Eventually she lured him onto the scale with food. The number settled. Camille smiled. Better. How much? Enough that I'm pleased. Not enough that Wyatt gets to increase chicken distribution. From the porch, Wyatt shouted, oppression. Camille raised her voice. I can hear you. That's why I said it. The cabin had changed. Not physically. The roof still needed work. The stove still clicked at night. The table remained scarred from decades of tools and hot pans. But people now entered it without Nolan feeling the urge to count the minutes until they left. Wyatt brought a pot of stew and claimed he had made too much. Lena stopped by after work with an updated trail map for Nolan's maintenance routes. Camille stayed for coffee after Alder's examination. At one point, all 4 adults stood in a room that had once felt crowded with Nolan alone. There was only one proper chair. Wyatt took it. Lena sat on the edge of the table. Camille leaned against the counter. Nolan stood near the stove. Alder moved between them, carrying one of Nolan's work gloves like a ceremonial object. He presented it to Camille. She accepted it solemnly. "Thank you." Alder wagged. Nolan said, "That was mine. You should be proud." He chose philanthropy. The puppy immediately tried to take it back. "Temporary philanthropy," Camille corrected. Alder's coat looked better now, still fluffy around the neck, still narrow through the body, but the brittle dullness was disappearing. His movements had more energy. His confidence had grown with it. He chased birch leaves across the porch until one landed on his nose. He bit his own harness strap whenever bored. He fell asleep in the middle of conversations as though somebody had turned off a switch. And every day, Nolan discovered another small adjustment he had made without deciding to make it. The water bowl was always full. The stove-side blanket was shaken out each morning. Tools were stored higher. Bootlaces were tucked inward. The cabin was reorganizing itself around another life. So was Nolan. He noticed this only when Lena finished her coffee one evening and left through the front door. The old Nolan would have closed it immediately against the cold. Instead, he stood on the porch for another minute while Wyatt loaded something into his truck, and Camille walked toward her Subaru. Alder sat beside Nolan. People waved. Nolan raised one hand. The door remained open behind him. He did not think about that until much later. Dana called 2 days after the map comparison. "I found Daniel Kerr." Nolan straightened from the section of radio antenna he had been repairing. "Where?" "Marquette County. Physical rehabilitation ended recently. He's been staying with his sister outside town." "Did you talk to him?" "Yes. How is he?" "Alive." Dana paused. "That seems to be the most useful answer right now." Nolan looked toward Alder. The puppy was wrestling a yellow leaf that had become trapped beneath one paw. "What did he say?" "He remembers Sector 14. Nolan waited. "And?" "He's willing to speak with me formally." "That's good. There's something else." Dana's voice changed slightly. "When I told him North Star A-17 had been located, he didn't ask where." Nolan frowned. "He didn't ask about the chip?" "No." "Health?" "No." "Then what did he ask?" Dana was quiet for one beat. "He asked me one question." Nolan waited. "Does he look back?" The words settled strangely. Nolan's eyes moved to Alder. The puppy had finally defeated the leaf. He picked it up, trotted down the short path toward the lake, went perhaps 20 feet, then stopped. Alder turned. His amber eyes found Nolan. Nolan did not move. The puppy held his gaze for a moment, then continued toward a patch of grass. Dana was still on the phone. "Nolan, I'm here. I'm setting up a video call first. Daniel's leg still gives him trouble on long drives." "When?" "Tomorrow afternoon." The next day, Dana joined the call from her office while Nolan connected through an old laptop Camille had loaned him because his own computer looked, in her words, like it remembered dial-up fondly. The connection flickered twice. Then Daniel Kerr appeared on the screen. Nolan recognized him from Everett's photograph, but the intervening weeks had changed him. Daniel was 45, around 6 feet tall, with the lean frame of a lifelong outdoorsman diminished slightly by recovery. His long face looked thinner than in the old photograph, cheekbones more visible, jaw partly covered by a short brown beard, threaded with silver. His light brown eyes were steady but tired. Short light brown hair showed more gray near the temples than the picture had. He wore a navy hiking jacket over a charcoal gray Henley. A black aluminum walking cane leaned against the chair beside him. Daniel looked at Nolan, then past him. "Is he there?" Nolan turned the laptop slightly. Alder was outside the open cabin door investigating pine needles. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. For the first time, emotion altered his controlled expression. Not joy exactly, not grief. Something complicated enough to contain both. Alder wandered farther along the porch. Then down onto the path, he found a stick, carried it several feet, stopped, his head lifted. He turned toward the cabin, toward Nolan. Daniel watched, his mouth opened slightly. No one spoke. Alder stood there another second, satisfied himself that Nolan had not vanished, and returned to the stick. Daniel leaned back, his eyes lowered briefly. When he looked up again, they shone, though his voice remained level. "Then I want to meet him." Daniel Kerr arrived in Coppervale beneath a sky so clear it made the coming weather difficult to believe. Lake Larkspur carried the pale blue of late autumn, and the forests above Silver Crown had entered that brief northern season, when yellow birch leaves still clung to their branches, while the first bare crowns showed through behind them. Wind moved lightly across the lake, cold enough to warn that winter was no longer far away. Nolan heard the vehicle before he saw it. A dark gray SUV came slowly along the cabin road and stopped beneath the white pines. Sheriff Dana Whitmore stepped out first, followed by Daniel. The video call had made Daniel look tired. In person, Nolan could see what recovery had taken from him. Daniel was 45, about 6 feet tall, but he no longer carried his outdoorsman's frame with the effortless balance visible in Everett Hale's old photographs. He remained lean and broad enough through the shoulders to suggest years spent climbing steep country with a working dog. Yet several weeks of injury and rehabilitation had taken weight from his face and body. His cheekbones stood more clearly beneath lightly weathered skin. Short, light brown hair, touched increasingly with gray at the temples, was neatly cut but not military short. A trimmed brown beard threaded with silver followed his jaw. His light brown eyes were observant and quiet, not defeated, but carrying the look of someone who had recently discovered that a familiar body could become unfamiliar overnight. He wore the same navy hiking jacket Nolan had seen on the video call, a charcoal Henley, brown outdoor pants, and dark hiking boots. A black aluminum cane rested in his right hand. He used it without embarrassment, though Nolan noticed Daniel rarely put his full weight on it unless the ground turned uneven. Alder was on the porch. The 15-week-old German Shepherd had been chewing a curled birch leaf between his paws. When Daniel stepped into view, the puppy lifted his head. Nolan said nothing. Daniel stopped at the bottom of the porch. Alder looked at him, then at Nolan, then back at Daniel. There was no sudden recognition, no dramatic rush across the yard, no invisible memory awakening from a mother the puppy had barely known beyond scent, warmth, and early life. Alder stood, walked down one step, sniffed the air, then approached Daniel with the cautious curiosity he gave unfamiliar people. Daniel did not crouch immediately. He let Alder choose the distance. The puppy sniffed his boot, then the metal cane. Alder sneezed. Daniel's mouth moved into the faintest smile. Not impressed. "He's difficult to impress," Nolan said. Alder circled once around Daniel's left leg, then returned to inspect the cane. Daniel lowered one hand. The puppy sniffed his fingers. His tail moved slowly. Only then did Daniel touch the top of Alder's head. His hand stayed there for perhaps 2 seconds. Nothing more. Yet Nolan watched Daniel's face change. The lines around his eyes tightened. His attention settled on Alder's amber gaze. "Same eyes," Daniel said. Nolan waited. Daniel shook his head lightly. "Not saying he remembers anything. I know. Vega had that color. Darker around the edges when she focused." Alder immediately lost interest in history and attempted to bite the rubber foot of Daniel's cane. Daniel pulled it away. "That's not from Vega." Nolan's mouth twitched. "No, that's entirely him." They went inside. Dana took the table. Daniel sat where the old armchair gave him enough room to stretch his injured leg. Nolan stood near the stove while Alder wandered between the adults, as if personally supervising the meeting. Camille arrived 10 minutes later. She carried no medical bag this time, only coffee in a paper carrier, and an expression that suggested she knew everybody in the room needed caffeine more urgently than diagnosis. Her chestnut brown hair, lit with copper where sunlight entered the window, was tied low against the collar of her moss green and cream flannel. The charcoal veterinary vest she usually wore had become so familiar around the cabin that Nolan barely noticed it anymore. She handed Daniel a cup. "Decaf." Daniel looked wounded. "I survived a landslide. And you'd like to survive your blood pressure." Dana accepted a black coffee. Nolan took the remaining cup. Alder sat expectantly. Camille looked down. "You don't get coffee." Alder tilted his head. "Not even if you make that face." The puppy changed the angle of his head. Camille looked at Nolan. "He's manipulative. He learned from Wyatt." The humor lasted only a moment. Daniel opened a slim folder he had brought with him. "I want to tell it from the beginning," he said. Dana nodded. "That's why we're here." Daniel rested both hands over the folder. 7 weeks earlier, Vega had not been on an official search. That mattered to him. She wasn't supposed to be finding anything. After the litter had been weaned, Vega had been rebuilding fitness slowly. Short walks, familiar terrain, light scent work, nothing demanding. Daniel had taken her along an old permitted service trail skirting the northern edge of Sector 14. The area itself remained closed because forestry crews were still dealing with post-fire timber and unstable ground. There were people authorized inside, Daniel said. Survey crews, forestry contractors, road people. A human trail wasn't automatically suspicious. Vega picked up one anyway, fresh. Daniel could tell by her behavior that she had scent rather than simple curiosity. She didn't pull. He glanced at Nolan. She never needed to. She'd work until the lead tightened, then wait for me. He let her follow for training value. The track crossed from the open trail toward the closed sector. Daniel checked his map. Still nothing alarming. A surveyor could have walked through. A contractor could have been checking equipment. Then Vega stopped near the first boundary marker. Daniel remembered that marker because he had seen it earlier in the season. It was wrong. Dana leaned forward slightly. Wrong how? Position. Daniel drew a small diagram on a blank page. The salvage line had been marked along this contour. That stake was maybe 40-50 yards uphill. Nolan watched him sketch. You recognized one stake from memory? I'd worked the area after the fire. Daniel looked at him. You remember terrain. Nolan understood. Some men remembered faces. Some remembered rooms. People who spent their lives outdoors remembered where the land bent. Daniel continued. He photographed the displaced marker. Then Vega resumed the track. Farther inside, Daniel found another, then a third. Not all equally displaced, but all in the same general direction, toward healthier forest. The scent trail continued. So you followed? Yes. Daniel's expression tightened. Farther than I should have without telling anyone. Nolan recognized that too. The moment when curiosity became commitment, and commitment quietly began writing rules of its own. Daniel found standing white pine and red pine with salvage markings painted across their trunks. The canopy was green. Bark showed no meaningful scorch. Some trees carried superficial fire damage on one side, but not enough to justify what Daniel understood the markings to mean. I'm not a forestry compliance officer, Daniel said. That mattered. I knew enough to know it looked wrong. I didn't know enough to call it fraud. Then he heard machinery. Not road maintenance. Logging machinery. Through the trees, he saw a tracked harvester bearing North Crown identification beyond the boundary shown on his field map. Fresh-cut green timber lay nearby. Dana asked, Did you see Grant Hollowell? No. Any employee you recognized? Not clearly enough to put a name on anyone. That disappointed Nolan. Daniel saw it. Good investigations are built on what you actually saw. Nolan gave him a look. Dana teaching classes? She threatened to. Dana drank her coffee without reacting. Daniel took photographs, boundary markers, tree markings, equipment, freshly cut timber. Then he recorded several GPS coordinates. What did Vega do? Camille asked. Daniel looked toward Alder. Her job. Nothing mystical. Nothing heroic. Once the human trail ended near a muddy equipment turnaround, Vega lost interest. She didn't discover a conspiracy, Daniel said. She followed somebody who happened to walk where Daniel Kerr probably wouldn't have gone otherwise. Nolan appreciated the wording. It kept Vega a dog, a remarkable dog, but still a dog. Daniel left Sector 14 that afternoon with questions, not conclusions. He intended to compare what he had seen with the most recent salvage authorization. Unfortunately, the cell connection in that part of the district was poor. Most of the photographs would not upload properly from his field device. So I backed them up. Where? Dana asked. Daniel hesitated. There's an old survey shelter near Black Birch Drainage. Nolan knew the name, not the shelter. Black Birch was a low drainage basin several miles northeast of the main Silver Crown roads, fed by two small streams and crossed by old logging tracks abandoned long before Nolan arrived. Daniel continued. The shelter had once been used by forest survey crews before satellite equipment made the location largely unnecessary. Weatherproof steel cabinets remained inside. Daniel carried an old field case in his truck, a hard polymer survey box with a rubber seal. He placed a backup memory card, printed coordinate notes, copies of the photographs, his handheld GPS backup, and a marked paper map inside of it. Then he locked it in one of the old cabinets. Nolan frowned. Why not take it home? I planned to. Daniel looked annoyed with himself. I was returning the next morning to verify two coordinates. The shelter was on my route. I didn't want the original device and backup traveling together. That made sense to Nolan. Separate copies, separate locations. It was the kind of cautious decision a man made because he assumed he would have another day. Daniel did not. 4 days later, the windstorm arrived. The forest did not care how careful a man had been with his evidence. It took one road, one falling tree, one bad step, and 1 hour Daniel could no longer remember clearly. When he opened his eyes in the hospital, the photographs in the cabin mattered less than one missing dog. Daniel stared into his untouched coffee. I went back in my head 1,000 times. Nobody interrupted. The road sloped down near a drainage cut. Rain had been steady all morning. I knew the bank was unstable. His hand tightened around the paper cup. I knew it. Nolan heard the self-accusation hidden inside the repetition, knowing, then failing anyway. A language he spoke fluently. Daniel remembered the tree cracking somewhere uphill. Vega was ahead but still within line distance. He turned. The shoulder beneath his right boot gave way. Mud slid. His leg went under him. He struck something. Rock or stump? The impact broke the sequence of memory. What do you remember last? Dana asked gently. Vega barking. Daniel stared toward the stove. Not panic. Alert. Then nothing. A road crew found Daniel hours later farther downslope. His right knee had been badly injured. A deep cut near his temple required stitches, and the concussion left several hours fragmented or absent. Vega was gone. Searchers returned when conditions allowed. Rain had destroyed most tracks. The drainage channel had risen. No body, no harness, no confirmed trail. Maybe she ran after help, Camille said. Maybe. Daniel's voice remained even. That's the problem with maybe. Nolan looked away. Too many lives could be built inside that word. Maybe Mason had held the line another second. Maybe Nolan could have moved faster. Maybe the ice would have broken anyway. Maybe. Daniel continued. He had tried to tell people about the survey case after leaving the hospital, but the exact location had become confused in his memory. There are 2 shelters. Dana pulled out a district map. Daniel pointed. One near Upper Black Birch. One lower, closer to an old culvert route. Which one? Daniel gave a humorless laugh. If I knew that, this would be easier. He remembered moving the case, remembered the steel cabinet, remembered rain striking the shelter roof. But the 2 structures were similar. Old cedar walls, metal roof, survey table, equipment lockers. His concussion had blurred the route. And because Sector 14 and portions of Black Birch drainage remained under slope stability restrictions after the storm, access now required Forest Service approval. Nolan leaned over the map. Both shelters are still standing, as far as current records show, Dana said. Then send someone to both. Dana's eyes lifted. We will when the area is cleared. When? When the geotechnical assessment says it's safe. That could be weeks. It could be days. Nolan straightened. That case could disappear. Dana's voice remained calm. Or it could sit exactly where Daniel left it. And if somebody else knows, we have no evidence anybody does. Nolan felt heat move through his chest. He disliked waiting. More accurately, he disliked imagining time continuing while something important remained beyond reach. He looked at the map. 2 shelters. 1 case. Proof, maybe. Or weather-damaged plastic containing nothing useful. But the possibility hooked into him. Daniel noticed. Don't do what I did. Nolan looked up. What? Turn one unanswered question into the only thing you can see. For a moment they regarded each other. 2 men who had each survived the wrong ending. Nolan folded the map. He told himself Daniel was talking about Sector 14. He was wrong. Over the following week, the case began occupying more of Nolan's life than he admitted. At first it looked harmless. He borrowed enlarged forest maps from Lena, cross-referenced old logging roads against Black Birch drainage, marked slope grades, checked culvert access, found historic survey routes in Wyatt's old ranger manuals. None of that was illegal. None of it even required leaving the cabin. That was how obsession often entered. Not through a locked door, through useful work. Nolan stayed awake past midnight one night. Then 2. Alder slept near the stove while Nolan compared coordinates. The puppy sometimes woke, walked over to the table, stared at him, then returned to his blanket. Nolan began skipping breakfast. Coffee became easier. He shortened maintenance jobs because he wanted to get back to the maps. During walks, he began choosing trails nearer the restricted district, not crossing closures, but tracing public approaches. Alder came with him. At first, the puppy seemed delighted. New smells, new ground, pine needles, mud, a deer track. Then Nolan started extending the walks, only slightly, 10 minutes, then another 10. He told himself Alder needed exercise. Alder was growing. Alder had energy. All technically true. But truth could be used dishonestly if a man selected only the pieces he liked. One afternoon, Camille found them nearly 2 miles from the cabin. She had been driving the service road after dropping medication at Wyatt's place when she saw Nolan's truck parked near a trail spur. She walked in and found Nolan standing over a map beside a trail marker. Alder lay on the ground, not injured, not distressed, simply finished. His dark red harness rose and fell with his breathing. Camille stopped several yards away. How long have you been out? Nolan glanced up. Not long. That isn't a number. Alder lifted his head when he heard her. His tail moved once, then his chin returned to the pine needles. Nolan folded the map. We were heading back. He clicked his tongue softly. Alder. The puppy looked at him. Come on. Alder remained down. Nolan waited. Alder. Camille's expression changed. He's done. He walked farther yesterday. He's 15 weeks old. I know. Then act like you know. The words hit Nolan harder than their volume deserved. He looked at her. I'm not hurting him. I didn't say you were. You're acting like it. Camille came closer. No. I'm acting like he's a puppy who doesn't know enough to tell a man he loves that the man is asking too much. Silence. Alder lay between them. Nolan's jaw tightened. He was bred for working. He was born 15 weeks ago. That's not what I meant. I know exactly what you meant. Camille's hazel green eyes stayed on him. You're looking at every sniff, every direction he chooses, every place he stops like it might lead you to something. Nolan looked away. This isn't about him. That's the problem. He turned back. Camille's voice softened. Alder isn't Mason. The name changed the air. Nolan went still. Don't. She almost stopped. He could see it, then chose not to. You can't save one life hard enough to rewrite another. His face closed. It happened so quickly Camille could almost have mistaken the previous warmth for imagination. Go home, Camille. Nolan, go home. She looked at Alder, then at him. Carry him back. Nolan said nothing. Camille left. The anger remained after her footsteps disappeared. For perhaps 30 seconds. Then something worse replaced it. Recognition. Nolan looked down. Alder was asleep, on a trail, because Nolan had walked him until a 4-month-old body simply switched off. Not cruelty, not abuse, nothing dramatic, which made it harder to excuse. Nolan crouched. Alder opened one eye. Nolan slipped one arm beneath his chest and another beneath his hindquarters. I know he carried him all the way back. That night the maps covered half the cabin floor. Nolan sat beside the low table with Daniel's approximate coordinates marked in pencil. He had not eaten dinner. The stove burned low. Rain ticked against the roof. Alder wandered over after waking. The puppy stepped directly onto the map. Nolan moved one sheet. Alder followed. Seriously, the puppy turned once, then dropped onto his side across the paper. One oversized front paw landed almost exactly over the printed label. Sector 14, Nolan stared. Alder gave a tiny sigh, then began snoring. For a second Nolan felt the old instinct to turn coincidence into information. Wrong. He caught himself. Alder had not chosen Sector 14. He had chosen warm paper near Nolan. That was all. Nolan looked at the ridiculous sleeping puppy covering the problem he had spent days trying to solve. A laugh escaped him. Quiet, unexpected. Alder continued snoring. You have no idea what any of this is. The puppy twitched in sleep. No idea who Vega was. Another tiny snore. No idea what a salvage boundary is. Nolan leaned back against the chair. And frankly, your work ethic is questionable. Something loosened. Not guilt. That remained. But the grip he had placed around the situation. He finally understood what Camille had seen. Alder had become useful to Nolan too quickly. First grounding him, then finding Harold, then linking him to Vega, then linking Vega to Sector 14. Nolan had started turning the puppy into a mission because missions were easier than love. Missions had objectives, timelines, success conditions. Love had none. Love simply gave a man something he could lose. The next morning Nolan folded every map, put them into a drawer, then made breakfast. For himself, too. He called Camille. She answered after 4 rings. Yes, I was wrong. Silence. Nolan frowned at the phone. You could make this less painful. I'm considering my options. Alder's fine. I know. You carried him home. How? Wyatt. Nolan stared toward the window. Of course. Camille's voice softened. You okay? No, it was the most truthful answer he could give. But I heard you. Another pause. That's enough. Nolan took Alder to Lake Larkspur. No map, no search, no trail objective. Just the lakeshore. The sky had gone pale silver, and wind pushed tiny waves against dark stones. Alder chased a dead leaf for several yards, lost it, found a stick. The stick was too large. That fact did not discourage him. He clamped his jaws around the center and ran. One end struck a birch sapling. The force spun Alder sideways. He rolled into the grass. For half a second he lay there stunned, then jumped up and attacked the stick for betraying him. Nolan laughed. Not almost, actually laughed. Alder froze, looked at him, then resumed the battle. Nolan sat on a lakeside log. He understood something then. If Alder never found another person, never wore a working harness, never entered a formal searchage, never did anything more important than destroy socks and fail against sticks, the $5 would still have been worth it. No achievement was required. No life had to be saved to justify another life being loved. That realization arrived quietly, as most important ones did. It lasted until the weather radio sounded that evening. Nolan was repairing a cabinet hinge when the alert tone cut through the cabin. A strong system was moving southeast from Lake Superior. High wind, heavy rain, rapid drainage rise, potential treefall. Alder raised his head from the rug. Nolan listened. Silver Crown crews had already begun pre-storm checks. Near Sector 14, Lena Hartwell had taken 3 maintenance workers out to inspect culverts and drainage crossings before conditions worsened. Nolan knew all 4 by sight. Jamie Rusk, 36, was a lean, dark-haired maintenance worker with a narrow face, short beard, and the restless energy of a man who preferred being outdoors because sitting still gave him too much time to worry. Aaron Phelps, 51, was broad and heavy-set, with thinning brown hair, a weather-red face, and a reputation for treating every broken culvert as a personal insult. Miguel Torres, 29, was compact, quick-moving, with warm brown skin, close-cropped black hair, and an easy temperament that made him the one Cruz sent when two stubborn co-workers had stopped speaking. Lena led them. By dusk, the rain had begun. By 7, radio calls became intermittent. By 7:30, nothing. At 7:46 p.m., Nolan's phone rang. Dana. He answered immediately. Varden, we've lost contact with Hartwell's maintenance crew. Nolan stood. Last position? Near the black birch access system. His eyes moved toward the dark window. Wind pushed against the glass. Dana continued. Forest Service is setting a staging point. I need someone who knows the old service roads. Nolan was already pulling on his field jacket. I'm coming. He ended the call. Alder stood beside the door, alert, dark red puppy harness hanging from its hook nearby. Nolan stopped. The little German shepherd looked at him. Nolan looked back. You're not a rescue dog. Alder tilted his head. Wind moved through the pines outside. Nolan reached for his keys. And today you're definitely not becoming one. Then he opened the door to the storm. By the time Nolan reached the rescue staging area, rain had erased the last softness from the evening. The Forest Service had chosen an old gravel maintenance yard several miles west of Black Birch Drainage because it sat on higher ground and still had radio coverage. County rescue trucks stood nose out beneath portable floodlights. Rope bags, medical kits, pry bars, chainsaws, blankets, and waterproof cases had been arranged beneath a canvas awning. No one moved quickly without purpose. Sheriff Dana Whitmore stood beside the hood of her county SUV, with a laminated district map spread beneath one gloved hand. Rain darkened the shoulders of her brown olive duty jacket. Her ash-blonde bob had been tucked behind both ears, and her pale steel blue eyes moved between the map, radio traffic, and the people around her. Nolan approached. Status. Dana pointed to 4 names on a clipboard. Lena Hartwell, Aaron Phelps, Miguel Torres, Jamie Rusk. No confirmed contact since the weather turned. Last position? Maintenance truck was found at the upper Black Birch Junction. Empty. Nolan studied the map. The old service road network looked simple on paper. It was not. Decades of logging, drainage work, rerouting, abandoned culverts, and washed-out tracks had produced roads that still existed on maps but not always in the forest. You have their assignment sheet? Dana handed it over. Lena's team had been checking 3 drainage points before returning west. 1 near an old pump house, 1 at an upper culvert, 1 near the Black Birch Spur. Nolan traced the route. They'd split only if something failed. Dana nodded. That's what worries me. A familiar green canvas jacket appeared beneath the awning. Everett Hale had arrived before Nolan. At 67, the retired K-9 trainer looked almost too thin for the weather, but his straight shoulders and careful movements made age seem more like a limitation he had learned to negotiate. Rain dotted his short silver hair and several days of gray-white beard. His old whistle remained tucked beneath the collar of his pale gray Henley. Camille Rowan stood beside him holding Alder's leash. The German shepherd puppy looked very small among the rescue equipment. At 15 weeks, Alder's body had begun filling out under his black and tan puppy coat, but he was still all oversized paws, narrow chest, soft fur, and uneven ears. His dark red adjustable harness hugged his little frame. One ear remained nearly upright, the other leaned sideways in the wet wind. Camille had wrapped a towel loosely across his back. Nolan frowned. Why is he here? Camille's hazel green eyes met his. Because Wyatt's road flooded at the lower crossing, and I was already bringing him to town when Dana called. He stays here. That was the plan. Alder saw Nolan. His whole body changed. He stood, tail moving, and pulled once toward him. Camille tightened the leash gently. Not yet. Nolan looked away. The county volunteers moved out in 2 teams. Nolan went with Dana's first group because he knew which of the older roads could still support foot travel if the main track had washed out. He did not lead the rescue. Dana had been clear about that, he advised. He pointed. He followed orders. It was harder than he expected. Rain hissed through the pines. Water crossed sections of the gravel road in shallow brown sheets. The beam of Nolan's flashlight caught pale birch trunks and wet ferns flattened by wind. Then somewhere uphill came a deep wooden crack. Nolan stopped. A white pine leaned. The trunk split halfway up with a sound like the earth tearing cloth. It fell through smaller trees and struck the ground hard enough to shake water from every branch around them. For everyone else, it was a tree. For Nolan, for one brutal second, it was ice. Alaska, white surface, a fracture running beneath boots. Mason somewhere beyond him, black water opening. Nolan's lungs locked. His fingers tightened around the strap of his flashlight. Someone said his name. He barely heard it. Then another sound came from behind, a leash clip. Quick claws on gravel. Camille had brought Alder from beneath the awning only far enough to stand near the edge of the safe staging corridor. The puppy had seen Nolan freeze. Alder pulled toward him. Camille watched Nolan's face, then loosened several feet of leash. Alder came forward, not fast. Rain had made the gravel uncertain beneath his puppy paws. He reached Nolan, looked up, and placed one front paw against the toe of the worn brown leather boot. The touch was almost nothing. Nolan stared down, Alder's black muzzle, wet whiskers, amber eyes, one absurdly tilted ear. Not Alaska, not ice, not Mason. A puppy standing in Michigan rain. Nolan inhaled, once. The breath shook, twice. His shoulders lowered, 3 times. The forest returned. Dana stood several feet away. She did not ask whether he was all right. Nolan appreciated her for that. He gave Alder one brief touch behind the ear. "I'm good." Camille led the puppy back toward the awning. Nolan continued down the road. Less than 40 minutes later, a volunteer found Lena. She was 50 yards below the old drainage crossing, sheltered behind a granite outcrop where she had managed to get out of the worst of the wind. Her brick-red hoodie was soaked dark beneath the yellow and gray reflective vest. Auburn hair had partly escaped her low ponytail and stuck to her cheeks. Mud covered one side of her charcoal work pants. She cradled her left arm against her body. Even in pain, her green eyes remained alert. When Nolan approached, she looked at him and said, "If this becomes a rescue report, I want it noted that the hill started it. Any chance you fell on the hill? Propaganda." Dana crouched beside her. "Where are the others?" Aaron and Miguel headed for the old pump house after the lower crossing started taking water. "Jamie?" Lena's humor disappeared. "He went to Black Birch Culvert. Alone? He was 10 minutes ahead of us. Radioed that runoff was backing up. Said he'd check the grate and meet us at the truck." "When was that?" "Before the wind jumped." Lena swallowed. "He never came back." A medic stabilized her shoulder. The information gave them direction. Aaron Phelps and Miguel Torres were found at the old pump house 25 minutes later. The structure sat in a shallow depression behind a stand of red pine. A fallen birch had jammed against the exterior door, trapping them inside rather than injuring them. County volunteers cut the smaller branches, while a Forest Service crew rigged a safe pull line. Aaron emerged first, his broad 51-year-old body filling the doorway as soon as the trunk shifted enough. His weather-reddened face looked offended, rather than frightened, thinning brown hair plastered to his forehead. "The drainage grate is garbage," he announced before anyone asked whether he was hurt. Miguel Torres followed him. At 29, Miguel was compact and quick-moving, with warm brown skin, close-cropped black hair, and the sort of easy expression that usually kept other men from arguing too long. Tonight he looked cold and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. He pointed at Aaron. "He spent 40 minutes insulting the county drainage system." Aaron scowled. It knew what it did. 3 safe, 1 missing. Jamie. The search radius tightened, but so did the weather. Black Birch lay farther east, near ground that had already been assessed as unstable after the previous windstorm. Dana refused to put teams blindly across the entire drainage. "We need a narrower direction," she said. At the staging point, Jamie's maintenance truck remained parked beneath the floodlights. Everett stood beside the open driver's door. A single work glove lay on the seat. Nolan understood before Everett spoke. "No." Everett looked at him. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." "Alder isn't a search dog." "I know. That means we treat anything he does as information, not proof." Dana approached. Everett explained the idea. Jamie's glove could offer a recent individual scent source. Alder had no operational certification, no formal search reliability, and almost no real training. But he had shown natural interest in human scent. Dana's answer was immediate. "Not in unstable ground." Everett nodded. "There's a corridor between the staging point and the West Black Birch spur that your team already cleared." Dana studied the map. A safe section. Controlled, long line. Rescue personnel accompanying them. No one depending solely on the puppy. Finally, she looked at Nolan. "If he stops, we stop." Nolan remembered Camille on the trail. "He stops, we stop." Alder sniffed Jamie's glove. At first, nothing. He licked the leather. Nolan closed his eyes briefly. Everett waited. Then Alder sniffed again. Longer. His little nose worked over the palm and wrist area. Everett clipped a long line to the dark red harness. "No command." Nolan glanced at him. "Why?" "Because he doesn't know one." That was the right answer. They let Alder move. The puppy wandered toward the road edge. Stopped to inspect wet grass. Nearly became distracted by a floating piece of bark. Then returned to the glove scent on Everett's hand. A minute later, he began moving east. Not with Vega's mature certainty. No professional rhythm. Just interest. The group followed. Nolan stayed several feet behind Alder while Everett handled the line. Rain weakened slightly, but wind continued pushing through the canopy. Alder moved along the cleared corridor, nose shifting between ground and air. After several hundred yards, he veered toward a thicket. His pace increased. He reached into the lower branches and pulled out a dark knit cap. Jamie's name was written on the inside tag. Nolan felt hope rise too quickly. They searched the immediate area. Nothing. No Jamie. No voice. No footprints that survived the rain. Alder sniffed the cap, then circled, went left, returned, went right, stopped. He looked at Everett, at Nolan, then at the ground. Again he circled. The rain had washed scent through ditches and across vegetation until whatever trail Jamie had left was no longer simple enough for a 15-week-old nose. Alder's movements slowed. His ears lowered. He sneezed, tried once more, then sat. His body trembled. Not fear. Cold. Exhaustion. Nolan stared at him. Something old and disciplined rose automatically inside him. Reset. Try again. Move. There was still a missing man. Time mattered. For half a heartbeat, Nolan almost opened his mouth. Then he saw Alder for what he was. Not A-17. Not Vega's son. Not potential. Just a wet puppy whose legs were tired. Nolan knelt. He opened the front of his olive field jacket and wrapped part of it around Alder's shoulders. Everett handed him a collapsible water bowl. Alder drank several small mouthfuls. "You don't have to know," Nolan said softly. The puppy rested his head against Nolan's thigh. "You're allowed to be little." No one hurried them. That was the moment Nolan finally understood the difference between needing Alder and loving him. Need asked what a creature could still give. Love noticed when it had already given enough. For several minutes they simply waited. Then the wind shifted. It came from the northeast now, carrying the smell of wet cedar, cold mud, standing water, and something else Alder noticed before any human did. His head lifted, nose high. He stood. Everett did not encourage him. Alder took several steps, paused, looked back toward Nolan. Nolan rose. "I'm here." Alder moved again. This time he angled away from the original path toward an old spur barely visible beneath brush. The team followed only after Dana confirmed by radio that the spur remained inside the cleared corridor, 50 yards, then another 50. A shape appeared between trees. An old survey shelter. Low cedar walls, metal roof. A pine had fallen across the front corner, blocking most of the entrance. Dana raised one hand. Everyone stopped. Then they heard it. 3 dull knocks. Pause. 3 more. "Jamie," Nolan called. A hoarse voice answered from inside. "Yeah." Relief moved through the group. Professionals took over. The trunk was stabilized. Branches were cut. A rescue volunteer opened enough space for Jamie to crawl through with assistance. Jamie Rusk emerged pale and shaking, short dark hair plastered to his forehead, narrow face streaked with grime beneath his short beard. But alive, Alder sat Nolan's leg. He did not understand why the humans suddenly sounded different. He only knew Nolan's hand had settled lightly on his back. Jamie was wrapped in a thermal blanket. While the medic checked him, he looked toward the shelter. "There's an old metal case in there." Dana turned. "What kind?" "In a maintenance locker. I saw it when I went inside before the tree came down. Thought it was abandoned survey gear." Nolan and Dana looked at each other. Neither had to say Daniel's name. The shelter was secured first. Jamie was evacuated. Only then did a Forest Service officer document the locker and authorize its opening in Dana's presence. Inside sat a weatherproof hard case. The seal was still intact. Daniel Kerr's initials were written beneath the handle. Dana photographed the case before opening it. Inside were dry papers, a folded original survey map, printed photographs, handwritten coordinates, a handheld GPS backup, memory cards inside a sealed pouch, dates, marker numbers, photographs of healthy timber carrying salvage paint, photographs of displaced boundary stakes, and images of North Crown equipment beyond the earlier mapped line. One video file still played. Vega appeared first, adult, strong, red working harness dark against her black and tan coat. She moved between trees while Daniel's voice came from behind the camera. "Good girl, show me." Vega followed the human trail past an orange boundary marker. Daniel's camera panned, green-white pines, healthy crowns, fresh salvage paint. Then farther through the trees, the unmistakable shape of North Crown logging equipment. The video ended. No one spoke for several seconds. Dana shut the case. "This is enough." Nolan looked at her. "For what?" Her steel blue eyes settled on the evidence. To stop asking politely. Near Nolan's boot, Alder had curled onto the dry corner of a rescue blanket. His eyes were closed. His breathing was deep. He had not solved a case. Had not rescued Jamie with strength or training. He had only helped a group of adults choose one direction over another. But somewhere in the dark forest behind them, a man who might otherwise have spent the night trapped beneath a fallen tree was alive. And the little German shepherd slept through the significance of it. $5 had once been the number someone put beside him. Tonight it meant nothing at all. Justice arrived in Coppervale without sirens. There were no midnight raids, no shattered doors, no photographs of Nolan standing over a defeated enemy while rain fell dramatically behind him. Instead, justice came through spreadsheets, satellite overlays, timber manifests, survey coordinates, emails printed in black ink and placed inside evidence folders. For Nolan, who had once belonged to a world where danger announced itself with gunfire, there was something almost disappointing about the quietness of it. And then he understood that quiet did not mean weak. 3 days after the Black Birch rescue, Dana Whitmore called him to the sheriff's office. Alder stayed at the cabin with Wyatt. The puppy had spent most of the previous 48 hours sleeping, eating, waking long enough to bite something inappropriate, and returning to sleep. Camille had checked him twice and declared him healthy, tired, and entirely unimpressed by the fact that half of Coppervale had begun calling him the little rescue dog. Nolan had corrected everyone who tried. He's a puppy. He had discovered that he liked saying it. Dana's office looked different than it had a week earlier. Maps covered one wall. Photographs from Daniel Kerr's weatherproof case had been enlarged and labeled. A state forestry compliance team had already compared the original GPS points with archived permit data. The mismatches were no longer questions drawn with a pen. They had measurements. Boundary stakes had been moved. Not all of them dramatically. Some 20 yards, some 50, a few much farther, always toward healthier timber. The photographs from Daniel's case showed mature white pine and red pine with intact crowns, green needles, and limited fire damage carrying salvage paint they should not have carried. The GPS data placed North Crown machinery in several of those same areas. But the case had opened more than one door. Once Dana had enough to request formal warrants through the proper agencies, investigators obtained North Crown's internal logging records. Those records told the larger story. Inventory numbers had been adjusted after field surveys. Load weights leaving the forest exceeded the volume authorized for certain sections. Some timber classified internally as hazard removal had come from stands the initial fire assessment labeled healthy or minimally affected. One spreadsheet column had been copied from month to month with tiny changes. 10 trees here, 20 there, one widened boundary, then another. Nolan stood beside Dana's desk while she pointed to the figures. How much? Enough, that's not a number. It's the number you need. He looked at her. Dana's pale steel blue eyes remained calm. Because the amount isn't what matters most right now. Pattern is. She turned another page. They didn't take an entire forest overnight. They took a little more than they were allowed. Then a little more again. Nolan stared at an aerial photograph. The legal salvage zone formed an irregular shape through the burned landscape. The unauthorized cuts crept beyond it like fingers. What about Hollowell? Grant signed several amended internal inventories. Did he order the stakes moved? We're still establishing who physically moved what. But he knew. Dana paused. That's what the digital records suggest. An internal message recovered from North Crown's servers referred to one questionable extension as only another strip. Another described the additional timber as not enough to matter once the road is already in. The language bothered Nolan more than a confession might have. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. Only another strip, not enough to matter. Men rarely woke one morning and decided to become someone they hated. They negotiated with themselves. A little farther, just this once. No one will notice. People still need jobs. The road is already there. Then one day the distance behind them was greater than the distance ahead. North Crown's harvesting operations in the disputed zones were suspended while state investigators worked through the permits, financial records, and contracts. Criminal charges tied to false records and unlawful timber removal followed against Grant and 2 senior managers. Grant did not flee. He did not threaten witnesses. He hired an attorney, reported when instructed, and, according to Dana, looked older every time she saw him. Nolan encountered him once outside the county administration building. Grant wore the same tan work jacket and navy polo Nolan remembered from the trail maintenance day. His salt and pepper hair remained neatly combed, but the self-assurance had gone out of his posture. He stood with one hand resting against the roof of his truck, while his attorney spoke several yards away. For a moment, Grant and Nolan simply looked at one another. Then Grant said, "I told myself we were keeping people working." Nolan did not answer. Grant glanced toward the courthouse. After the fire, everybody was scared. Contracts were shrinking. Crews had families. Then there was timber standing right there. His jaw tightened. "I kept thinking one more section wouldn't change anything." Nolan finally spoke. Apparently it did. Grant nodded once, no anger, no excuse left strong enough to carry. Then his attorney called him. Grant walked away. Nolan did not feel victorious. He thought of Dana's maps. Every moral line was probably easier to move when a man only moved it a few feet at a time. He drove home. Alder met him at the cabin door carrying one of Wyatt's gloves. The puppy had acquired the glove through means no court in Michigan could have adequately explained. Wyatt stood behind him. That's theft. Nolan looked at Alder. Pattern of behavior. Wyatt pointed at the dog. Finally, law enforcement understands. For the first time in days, Nolan laughed before remembering he was supposed to resist. A week later, Everett Hale arrived with a folder. This one contained no evidence of logging, no photographs of Sector 14. It contained Alder's life, or at least the parts humans had bothered to record. Northstar had reconstructed the transfer chain. After the storm damaged the puppy facility, A-17 had gone with an emergency volunteer to a temporary foster home south of the district. The paperwork should have been entered that evening. It wasn't. The foster was a middle-aged couple already caring for 2 dogs and an elderly parent. They kept A-17 safely for several days, but a family medical emergency forced them to send him to a trusted acquaintance who had helped with animals before. That person intended to contact Northstar, then assumed the foster couple already had. A week passed. A family nearby agreed to take the puppy temporarily. They fed him, gave him shelter, and apparently cared for him well enough at first. But they were already preparing to move out of state. The puppy became one more problem on a long list of unfinished arrangements. So he went to another acquaintance, then eventually to Chet Barlow. Chet had no registry information, no original paperwork, no idea the awkward German Shepherd belonged to a working dog program. He simply had a young dog he did not intend to keep. And so there had been a cardboard sign, $5. Everett sat at Nolan's kitchen table with the folder open between them. No trafficking, he said. No deliberate theft. No one tried to hurt him. Not that we found. Nolan looked toward the stove. Alder was lying upside down on his blanket, back legs open without dignity, one ear flattened beneath his own head. So how did everybody lose him? Everett considered the question. Nobody lost him all at once. That answer stayed in the cabin. One person thought another had called. One family believed the paperwork would follow. Someone assumed the dog would stay only 2 days. Someone else thought a name was less important than feeding him. Everyone had an explanation. Most explanations were probably true. The problem was that no one stayed responsible long enough for the truth to matter. Nolan looked at Alder. Everett followed his gaze. He fell through gaps. Nolan nodded slowly. Alder rolled onto his side. The puppy opened one amber eye, saw Nolan, closed it again. There was no dramatic choice in what Nolan had done at the flea market. He had simply stopped the chain. For once, when responsibility reached someone's hands, that person had not passed it forward. That realization affected him more than he expected. Not because it made him noble. He did not think it did. It simply reminded him that sometimes goodness was less about heroic action than about refusing to say, "Someone else will handle it." The only past they could not reconstruct belonged to Vega. Search records were reviewed again. Forest Service crews checked drainage basins when conditions became safe. Daniel provided every route he could remember. Everett went through old scent training maps. No confirmed sign of Vega emerged. No red harness. No remains. No verified sighting. Nothing. The absence hurt Daniel differently now that other questions had answers. It had edges, a place to sit, but no ending. 2 weeks after the North Crown warrants, Daniel returned to Lake Larkspur. The afternoon was bright and cold. Most birches were bare now. Their white trunks stood pale against dark pines, while fallen leaves gathered at the lake edge in damp copper-colored bands. Daniel walked slowly beside Nolan. His black aluminum cane tapped occasionally against stone. His right leg had improved, but cold weather tightened it. Alder ranged ahead along the shore in his dark red harness. He had grown even in the few weeks Daniel had known him. His ribs no longer showed. His puppy coat had thickened around the neck and chest, and the ear that had once struggled to stand now held upright with increasing confidence. The other still leaned slightly whenever something confused him. At that moment, it was confused by a floating leaf. Alder stalked it through ankle-deep water. The leaf moved away. Alder froze, offended by physics. Daniel smiled. They continued walking. Neither man spoke about Vega at first. Nolan had learned not to fill grief with noise merely because silence made other people uncomfortable. Eventually, Daniel said, "They called off the expanded search yesterday." Nolan nodded. "I heard. It was the right decision." Another tap of the cane. "That doesn't make it feel right." "No." Daniel looked out across the lake. I keep thinking there's a version where she found some road and somebody took her in. There might be, maybe. Daniel smiled without humor. There's that word again. Nolan understood. They walked another 100 yards. Ahead of them, Alder chased a pine cone, abandoned it, and trotted toward a patch of reeds. Then he stopped, turned. His amber gaze moved past Daniel and found Nolan. A brief check, nothing more. Daniel became very still. There. Nolan looked around. What? Daniel's face softened. Vega. The word escaped before he could stop it. He shook his head. No, he watched Alder, not Vega. A small smile appeared. Him. Alder turned back to the reeds. Daniel exhaled. Good. Nolan looked at him. Daniel nodded toward the puppy. I've been doing that in my head since I saw him, looking for pieces of her. He shifted his grip on the cane. That's not fair. To him, to either of them. Daniel had spent weeks wanting Alder to prove that something of Vega had returned. But standing beside Lake Larkspur, he finally understood that love did not survive by making copies of what was lost. Sometimes it survived by recognizing the familiar, and then allowing the new life in front of you to remain entirely itself. Alder was not evidence that Vega had come back. He was evidence that absence did not get to own everything that came after it. Daniel lowered himself onto a lakeside log. Nolan sat beside him. Alder continued exploring within sight. Daniel rested both hands over the top of his cane. I taught dogs how to find people. Nolan waited. Daniel looked at the water. After Vega disappeared, I was the one who got lost. The sentence required no answer. Nolan thought about Mason. Not the broken ice, not the final seconds. Mason laughing in a freezing aircraft hangar because Nolan had once burned military coffee so badly even the mechanics refused to drink it. Mason asleep against a duffel bag. Mason alive before he became the worst day of Nolan's life. For years, Nolan had allowed the ending to consume everything before it. He had turned a man into a death, just as Daniel had almost turned Vega into an absence. Nolan did not tell Daniel all of that. He only said, Daniel looked at him. The two men understood the entire conversation inside the single word. That was enough. Everett visited Silver Crown several days later. Alder was outside attempting to dig through the first thin crust of frozen soil beneath the porch. Everett watched him for a while. He's filling out. Camille says appropriately, good. Everett took the old whistle from beneath his forest green canvas jacket and rolled it between two fingers. Still interested in search work, Nolan looked at him. Alder? You. That answer caught him. Everett leaned against the porch rail. He has potential. That doesn't mean he owes anybody a career. Nolan nodded. When he's old enough, he could try foundation work. Basic scent games, confidence, environmental exposure, nothing heavy, and if he hates it, then we stop. Nolan looked toward Alder. The puppy had discovered that frozen mud did not surrender as easily as ordinary mud, and was now complaining about the injustice by pawing harder. Everett continued. There's another option. What? Train with him. Nolan laughed once. I thought I was retired. Everett's gray-brown eyes remained steady. From one job. Nolan's smile faded. The words opened something uncomfortable. A future. Not a mission. Not a return to the Navy. No one was offering him the uniform he had left. No one was asking him to become the man he had been before Mason died. Everett was offering something smaller. Weekend training. Volunteer searches when qualified. Trail work. Learning with a young dog who would fail as often as he succeeded, being part of a team without belonging to the past. Nolan looked at Alder. Let me think. Everett nodded. He did not push. That was another reason Nolan trusted him. Nolan thought for 11 days, then called. Winter came to Silver Crown quietly. By early December, a thin layer of snow covered the high trails. Lake Larkspur darkened beneath a pale sky, and Lake Superior could sometimes be seen from the upper lookout as a silver line beyond the northern ridges. Alder was nearly 7 months old now. The $5 puppy had become a lanky adolescent shepherd, still obviously young but no longer fragile. His ribs were buried beneath healthy muscle and a thick winter coat. The black saddle across his back had deepened. Tan fur warmed his chest and legs. Both paws still seemed too large. One ear stood perfectly upright. The other usually did too, except when Alder was confused, when it developed an independent opinion and tilted sideways. His same dark red harness had been adjusted larger as he grew. A simple patch now read, Alder SAR Foundation inside the identification panel. Smaller lettering preserved the old registry. North Star A17. Nolan liked it that way. Nothing erased, nothing worshipped. A17 was where Alder had begun. Alder was who he had become. Nolan changed too, though the changes were less visible. He still lived in Wyatt's cabin, still repaired pumps and trail bridges, still woke from bad dreams. Still had days when machinery sounded wrong or running water became too loud. Healing had not turned his past into a story about somebody else. It had simply made more room around it. One cold morning, Nolan and Alder climbed toward Silver Crown Fire Lookout. Snow crunched beneath Nolan's worn brown boots. His olive field jacket was zipped against the cold red and dark navy flannel visible at the collar. His short dark hair, silver at the temples, caught tiny flecks of snow. Alder moved ahead along the trail, not working, just walking. The old lookout tower rose above the pines. Somewhere below the ridge, a tree cracked under the weight of cold. The sound ran through the forest. Nolan stopped. His shoulders tightened. For a heartbeat. Ice, Mason, black water. The memory reached for him. Alder stopped ahead, turned. Amber eyes. He did not run back, did not touch Nolan, did not rescue him. He simply waited. Nolan closed his eyes briefly. One breath, then another. Cold Michigan air. Pine snow. A dog waiting ahead. Nolan opened his eyes, took one step, then another. Alder turned forward and continued climbing. That was the difference. Once, the puppy had needed to come all the way back. Now Nolan could meet him halfway. At the top, the world opened. Miles of northern forest stretched beneath Silver Crown. Lake Larkspur lay dark blue among the trees. Farther north, Lake Superior caught winter sunlight like hammered silver. Nolan rested one hand on the wooden railing. With the other, he reached beneath his flannel and removed Mason Creed's dog tag. The metal was worn smooth in places from years of being held too tightly. Nolan looked at it. For a long time, Mason had existed in his mind only at the edge of broken ice. Today another memory came first. Mason laughing. That was all. Nolan placed the tag on the railing. He did not throw it away, did not bury it beneath snow, did not say goodbye. Mason still belonged in his life, just not in every room of it. Alder sat nearby. Nolan looked at him. For some reason he remembered cardboard, a flea market, a handwritten sign, $5, and a man saying not to expect much. Nolan understood now how meaningless that number had always been. $5 had never measured Alder. It had only measured what one person knew about him on one particular morning. Nolan had done something similar to himself. He had taken the worst years of his life, the nightmares, the cabin, the silence, the guilt, and used them as a price tag for every year he had not yet lived. Alder stood and moved toward the stairs. Down 3 steps, then 4. He stopped, turned. One ear tilted slightly. Nolan looked into the amber eyes waiting below him. A smile came without effort this time. I'm coming. Alder continued down. Nolan picked up Mason's tag and slipped it back beneath his shirt. Then he followed, and this time he meant it. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, bright signs, or answers that make every wound disappear. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through a door we almost did not open, a stranger we almost passed by, or even a small dog the world decided was worth only $5. Nolan thought he was giving Alder a second chance. In time, he learned that grace often works in both directions. The one we rescue may become the one who reminds us to keep walking. The hand we offer may become the hand that steadies us later. And the life we once believed had lost its purpose may still be carrying a purpose God has not revealed yet. There may be seasons in our own lives when we feel forgotten, misplaced, or judged by the worst chapter we have lived through. But our value is never determined by a price tag, a failure, a loss, or another person's opinion. God sees the whole road when we can see only the next few steps. Sometimes faith is not understanding why something happened. Sometimes faith is simply finding the courage to take one more step when love turns around and waits for us. If this story reminded you of someone who needs hope today, please share it with them and tell us in the comments, has a person, an animal, or an unexpected moment ever entered your life at exactly the time you needed it most? If you enjoy stories about loyalty, courage, second chances, and the quiet ways God can work through both people and animals, please subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories and join us for the next journey. May God bless you and your family, protect the people and animals you love, give strength to those carrying grief in silence, and guide every lost heart toward the place where it can finally feel at home again.